We all know how loud life can get. Phones buzzing nonstop, traffic blaring, thoughts racing even when the room is quiet. Some people run faster to escape it, while others bury themselves in endless noise, hoping silence won't find them. But what if stillness isn't emptiness? What if it's the place where peace finally speaks? In today's video, we'll talk about Be Still. He is near, the beginning of a journey where hearts learn to listen once more. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The morning mist clings to the valley like a veil, soft and slow, wrapping the earth in silence. The oak tree stands in its quiet glory, branches heavy with gold and flame, and beneath it, the teacher remains seated, as if carved from the stillness itself. His eyes are open, yet they wander nowhere. His hands rest upon an open scroll, unmoved by the gentle wind that plays with its edges. It is not the sound of command that draws the people near, but the absence of demand. The quiet calls to them. From the village below, figures begin to appear along the worn path, farmers with cracked hands, mothers with sleepless eyes, children chasing after leaves as if they were sparks from heaven. Some come with expectation, others only with curiosity. They whisper to one another, asking who he is, what he reads, and why his words are carried by the wind as though the trees themselves lean closer to hear. The teacher looks up as they arrive, but says nothing. Instead, he closes the scroll and rests it on his lap. His gaze meets each soul that dares to step forward. There is no judgment there, only knowing, an understanding that pierces softly as sunlight through mist. One by one, they sit upon the damp ground, forming a circle around him. No one speaks, for words feel too heavy for this kind of peace. At last, he breaks the silence with a voice that feels like rain meeting earth. "You have come from noise," he says, his tone neither question nor command. "The world speaks loudly, does it not?" The crowd nods, some too tired to respond aloud. He continues, "Noise is not always sound. Sometimes it is the weight we carry. Our fears, our need to be heard, our endless reaching for what we do not understand. Yet, silence." His hand rises, brushing away a falling leaf that lands on the scroll. Silence is the bridge to what is true. A woman near the front, her shawl faded and torn, raises her hand timidly. "How do we cross such a bridge, teacher, when we cannot see where it leads?" The teacher smiles faintly. "By not looking with your eyes." Murmurs ripple through the crowd, not of confusion, but of recognition. Somehow, they know this truth, though they have forgotten it. He opens the scroll again, but does not read. Instead, he gazes at the words as though seeing through them. "The heart," he says softly, "was made for stillness. The soul was not shaped to run forever in circles. The world tells you to speak, to strive, to prove yourself, but peace whispers differently. Peace says, 'Be still and listen.'" A young man at the edge of the circle leans forward. His hands are calloused, his clothes stained with soil. "But what if the silence answers with nothing?" he asks, his voice carrying the tremor of the desperate. The teacher lifts his eyes to meet his. "Then you have heard everything." The words settle like dust after a storm. A sparrow lands nearby, pecking at a seed. The teacher watches it for a moment and says, "Even the sparrow trusts what it cannot see. The ground provides, the sky holds. Faith is not found in shouting for answers, but in resting long enough to hear the question within yourself." The young man lowers his gaze, his heart heavy with something he cannot name. The teacher rises slowly, the leaves whispering beneath his sandals. He moves through the gathered people, the air shifting with his passing. "You came seeking words," he says, walking among them. "But words are only doors. You must learn how to step through." He stops beside an old shepherd, his hair white and tangled with age. "Tell me," he asks gently, "when your sheep wander, do you call until they return, or do you walk into the hills to find them?" "I go to find them, master," the shepherd answers. "Then go into your silence the same way," the teacher replies. "Seek the stillness, and it will show you what you have lost." The people exchange glances. No one dares to speak, but their breathing slows, their hearts loosen. The old oak seems to stretch higher, its branches echoing the teacher's calm. He returns to his place beneath the tree, kneels, and places his hand upon the earth. All things that live, he says, learn from the rhythm of rest. The soil must rest after harvest, the body after labor, the heart after grief. Be still long enough, and the world will speak to you again, not in thunder, but in truth. For a moment, the entire clearing feels alive. Even the wind softens its breath. The villagers sit motionless, yet within them, something ancient begins to stir, an understanding that peace is not found but remembered. The teacher lifts his eyes toward the forest canopy, where sunlight filters through in trembling gold. He smiles faintly. Now, he murmurs, you are ready to hear. He unrolls the scroll once more, the parchment whispering as it unfurls across his knees. His fingers trace the inked lines, and his voice lowers to a whisper meant for the soul rather than the ear. The crowd leans closer, hearts open, the air holding its breath. The first story begins, not from a place of power, but of quiet grace. And beneath the turning leaves, the teacher speaks of a stream that once roared with pride until it learned to flow gently around the stones that shaped its path. The teacher's voice flowed like water, soft, continuous, and alive. The crowd sat still beneath the oak, their hearts tuned to his rhythm. He began to speak, not loudly, but with the steady calm that silences even the wind. There was once, he said, a stream born in the high mountains. It was wild, impatient, and full of strength. It wanted nothing more than to reach the sea. Day and night it rushed forward, cutting through rock and root, never resting. It boasted in its might, saying, "Nothing can stop me. I was made to move." He paused, letting the sound of a real stream nearby echo his words. The people listened, the image forming clearly in their minds. But the mountain had other plans, he continued. For every mile the stream gained, it met a new stone. Some small, some great, immovable. The water raged against them. It struck and frothed, shouting against what it could not move. Days passed, years even, and still the stones stood firm. The teacher leaned forward, tracing a small line in the dirt with his finger. The stream grew weary. It began to break apart, losing its strength in its own anger. It cried out to the sky, saying, "Why have I been given power if not to shape the world before me?" And the sky, hearing its cry, answered only with rain. He looked up toward the trees, their branches glistening from the earlier storm. Then something changed. The stream noticed the rain did not fight the stones. It fell softly, and still it shaped the earth. The stream grew quiet, humbled. It began to flow gently, winding around the obstacles it once despised. And in doing so, it discovered a new power, the strength of surrender. A little girl near the front whispered, "What happened then?" The teacher smiled. Then the stream reached the sea. Not in fury, but in peace. It did not conquer the stones. It learned from them. For a moment, no one spoke. The story hung in the air like incense, fragrant and invisible. Even those who had not come seeking wisdom felt something stir within them. An older man broke the silence. "Are we like that stream, teacher?" he asked. "In more ways than you know," the teacher replied. "You spend your years crashing against what stands before you: grief, failure, pride, loss. You believe your strength is proven by resistance. But true strength is in learning when to yield. The stone that blocks you may be the very thing guiding your path." He rose slowly, stepping toward the stream that ran just beyond the edge of the clearing. The crowd followed, their feet soft upon the moss. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, moving in glints of gold and blue. He crouched beside it, cupping a handful of the cool flow, and let it fall through his fingers. "See this?" he said quietly. "It bends. It waits. It finds another way. It does not lose itself by flowing around the stone. It finds itself there." The villagers nodded, though some wore faces of quiet resistance. It is not easy, after all, to accept stillness as strength. One young woman, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, stepped forward. "But teacher," she said softly, "if we yield too much, will we not be trampled by the world?" The teacher turned to her, his expression kind but steady. The stream that surrenders is never trampled. It shapes valleys. It carves canyons. It gives life. Only what refuses to bend becomes brittle and breaks. A murmur of understanding swept through the group. Even the doubters found themselves quieting, sensing that his words reached deeper than comfort. They cut through pride like light through fog. He motioned for them to sit once more. The sound of the stream carried through the silence, rhythmic and unbroken. Patience, he said, is not the art of waiting idly. It is the strength to keep moving gently when all your soul wants is to push and prove. The stones in your life were never your enemies. They are your teachers. An old woman, leaning on a wooden cane, smiled faintly. Then, perhaps, she whispered, I've had many good teachers. The teacher laughed softly, the sound like wind chimes in a quiet house. Yes, he said, and each lesson brings you closer to peace, if only you will listen. The leaves above rustled gently, as though the forest itself agreed. The teacher looked up, his eyes reflecting the golden shimmer of sunlight filtering through the branches. The stream learned to see the beauty in its obstacles, he said. So must you. When you stop fighting what slows you, you'll find that it's not holding you back, it's shaping your way. The crowd sat with these words, the quiet between them more meaningful than speech. The teacher picked up a fallen leaf and set it upon the water. It drifted gently, carried by the current, neither rushing nor resisting. Be like this, he said softly. Let what is greater than you carry you where you are meant to go. The people watched the leaf float away, vanishing around the bend of the stream. For a long time, no one spoke. They only listened, to the flow of the water, to their own slowing breath, to the hush that followed wisdom. The teacher stepped back beneath the oak, his shadow long upon the grass. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting everything in warm amber. He unrolled his scroll again, the parchment glowing in the late light. His eyes softened as he read silently for a moment, then lifted them to the faces before him. Now, he said, his voice a gentle murmur, we shall learn not only to flow, but to listen to the wind itself, for it carries truths that no page can hold. The people leaned forward once again, hearts open, ready for what he would speak next beneath the whispering autumn sky. Morning sunlight spilled through the canopy, shimmering like gold dust upon the earth. The crowd had grown larger now, some familiar faces from the nearby village, others who had traveled from distant roads just to hear the teacher speak. They came quietly, carrying bread, flasks of water, and stories too heavy for conversation. Yet amidst them all, one figure stood apart. A young scribe named Elior, kneeling near the teacher with parchment and ink, determined not to miss a single word. Every phrase the teacher spoke, Elior wrote, every pause, he marked with a line. His hand moved quickly, desperate to capture it all, but the wind, mischievous and untamed, danced through the clearing, teasing the edges of his papers. Once, twice, he caught them in time, but on the third gust, his ink-stained pages scattered like startled doves. No, 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 he gasped, lunging to grab them. A few landed in the stream and bled black into the water. Others took flight into the forest, lost among branches. The people around him turned their eyes away in sympathy, but the teacher merely watched with calm amusement. Elior fell to his knees, clutching what few pages he had saved. Teacher, he said breathlessly, I was writing your words. I wanted to keep them safe, but the wind has taken half of them. The teacher looked at him kindly. The wind takes nothing it does not first give, he said. Elior blinked in confusion. But now I will not remember everything you said. The teacher smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing with gentleness. Then you must listen not to remember, but to understand. He stood, walking toward the young man. The crowd watched silently as the teacher crouched beside him. The air was warm and still now, the last of the papers fluttering softly at his feet. He picked one up, the ink smeared beyond recognition, and held it to the light. Tell me, he asked, what did this word say before the wind touched it? I don't know, Elior admitted, ashamed. It's gone. And yet, said the teacher, the meaning remains in you. You heard the word, did you not? Elior hesitated. Yeah, But if I cannot write it, how can I keep it? The teacher pressed the ruined page gently into his palm. Ink fades, paper burns, but what is lived cannot be lost. Words are not meant to be trapped, they are meant to breathe. He rose to his full height, letting the wind stir his hair and robes. The wind you curse is the same spirit that carries life into every corner of creation. If you wish to keep wisdom, you must learn to live it. Let it shape you the way the wind shapes the trees. Elior's shoulders sank. He looked at the soaked parchment in his hand, torn and useless. Then I've failed as a scribe. No, said the teacher, placing a hand on his shoulder. You've only failed to see that a scribe's greatest work is not what he writes, but what he becomes. The crowd murmured softly. The words struck something deep, even among those who could neither read nor write. The teacher turned his gaze toward the forest edge, where the lost papers had vanished into the distance. The wind will scatter what you cling to, he said, so that your hands may finally open to receive what lasts. For a while, no one spoke. The forest hummed with quiet approval, the leaves whispering like pages turned by an unseen hand. The young scribe sat still, his ink bottle beside him, his fingers trembling, not with anger, but awakening. He closed his eyes and repeated the teacher's earlier words, not aloud, but within. And he realized, for the first time, that they lived there now, as if written upon his heart. The teacher sat once more beneath the oak. There are many kinds of listeners, he said. Some here to collect, some here to compare, but few here to change. To truly listen, one must empty themselves as the wind empties the trees in autumn. Only then can new leaves grow. An old man at the back nodded slowly. So even the wind teaches us? The teacher's eyes softened. Everything that moves with grace is a teacher. A breeze swept through again, gentler this time. It lifted the last parchment from Elior's lap and carried it toward the open sky. He didn't chase it. Instead, he smiled, watching it drift upward like a prayer. Good, the teacher said quietly. Now you have learned to let go. Elior turned to the crowd, humbled. I thought my task was to preserve his words, he said, but now I see. They were never meant to be preserved. They were meant to be practiced. The teacher's eyes glowed like the morning sun reflected in water. Then write them in the only place no wind can reach. Where is that, master? Elior asked. In the way you live. The clearing grew still once more. The people sat motionless, some closing their eyes, others gazing at the sky where the parchment had disappeared. The lesson lingered not in the air, but within them, etched deeper than ink could ever go. The teacher looked at them, his voice a soft whisper. Each of you carries a page the world has yet to read. Be careful what you allow it to say. He turned his eyes to the distant horizon, where the trees shimmered like waves in the wind. The day was beginning to fade, and with it came the hush before evening. Somewhere beyond the hills, a faint sound of a tree creaking echoed through the valley, a quiet reminder that even stillness can speak. And so, as the people remained seated, their hearts open and their thoughts quiet, the teacher prepared to speak once more, this time not of wind or words, but of a tree that had learned the art of listening. The afternoon sunlight softened as clouds began to gather above the hills, their gray edges curling like folds of linen. The teacher rose from his seat beneath the oak and stepped toward the field beyond the clearing, where a single withered maple stood apart from the rest. Its bark was dry, its branches twisted in strange directions, and though autumn had colored every other tree in gold and flame, this one remained bare, stripped by years of wind and silence. The people followed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Elior, the young scribe, clutched his new blank parchment, no ink this time, only attention. The teacher stopped before the tree and laid his hand upon its trunk. This tree, he said softly, once grew strong and full. Birds nested in its branches, its roots drank deeply from the earth, and it stood proud among the grove. But seasons changed, and when the rain stopped, it began to thirst. Instead of listening for the water, it strained toward the dry wind. The crowd leaned closer, unsure if he spoke of the tree or of them. It grew desperate, the teacher continued. It reached higher and higher, chasing what could not nourish it, and when the rain returned, it did not drink. It had forgotten how. A child spoke up timidly. How can a tree forget? The teacher smiled gently. The same way a heart does, by listening only to what is loud. The child looked down at his feet, his small hands brushing fallen leaves. The people fell silent, their eyes tracing the cracks along the maple's trunk. The teacher stepped back and looked toward the clouds that now thickened with promise. A low rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "The rain speaks before it arrives." He lifted his face to the sky as the first drops began to fall, tapping against the branches like gentle knocking. The tree made no sound, yet its roots, hidden beneath the soil, stirred faintly. The teacher knelt, touching the ground near its base. "Even now," he said, "it listens. It remembers." Rain began to fall steadily, soaking the dry earth and the people who stood motionless. Some covered their heads, others didn't care. The teacher's robe darkened with water, but he paid no mind. His voice rose above the soft percussion of rain. All things that live must listen to survive. The ground listens to the sky, the river listens to gravity, the soul must listen to the truth. When we stop listening, we dry from the inside, though we may still appear alive. Elior, his hair damp and dripping, spoke quietly. "Then this tree can live again?" The teacher's gaze remained on the trunk. "Yes, if it remembers the sound of rain." The words lingered in the air, caught between thunder and silence. The people closed their eyes and listened, not to him, but to the rhythm around them. The forest exhaled. The scent of wet soil rose like incense. Each drop struck leaf and skin alike, carrying the same message: be still and receive. When the rain softened, the teacher stepped forward and broke off a dead twig from the maple. He held it up before them. "This branch fell not because it was weak," he said, "but because it stopped listening. It turned inward, deaf to what gave it life. Remember this, even the strongest fall when they trust only their own roots." He tossed the twig into the stream where Elior had once lost his pages. It floated away, light and directionless. Then he placed his hand on the trunk again. "But if even this tree listens now," he murmured, "then no heart is too dry to remember the rain." The people stood silently, rain still pattering on their clothes, unsure whether they were witnesses to a story or part of it. The teacher's eyes moved over them slowly. "Many of you," he said, "are like this tree, standing tall yet empty. You have heard the truth many times, but hearing is not the same as listening. To listen is to let the sound reach your roots." A woman with weathered hands stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Teacher, how do we begin again if we have forgotten how to listen?" The teacher looked at her with deep kindness. "By letting silence speak before you do. By opening your heart the way the earth opens for rain. You do not need to chase the voice of heaven. It already speaks through every drop, every breath, every heartbeat that waits without rushing." The woman bowed her head. "Then perhaps I have not been silent long enough." He smiled faintly. "Few have, but every day holds a new rain." The storm began to fade into a soft drizzle. Mist rose from the ground like breath, and the old tree seemed somehow less lifeless, its bark darker, its posture more alive. Elior stepped closer and whispered, "It looks different already." The teacher nodded. "Because it remembered. Growth begins in remembrance." He turned back to the crowd, water dripping from his sleeves, and said, "When the rain stops, you will hear the earth sigh in gratitude. That sound, barely there, is how the world prays." The people listened, and indeed, faintly beneath the quiet, there was a soft settling of soil, a whispering tone that only the still-hearted could hear. The teacher closed his eyes for a moment, as if joining the earth's silent prayer. Then he opened them again and looked to the path beyond the trees. The clouds broke, revealing streaks of sunlight that glowed against the wet leaves. He began to walk, and the people followed, their feet splashing lightly in the puddles. Elior lingered one last moment, placing his hand upon the tree's trunk. "Listen well," he whispered, repeating the teacher's words. "The rain remembers you." Then he turned to follow, inkless parchment tucked against his chest, knowing there was more to learn, not of trees or storms this time, but of burdens carried too long by those who had forgotten the art of letting go. The morning after the rain came bright and clear. The air felt new, washed clean of all that had lingered the day before. Mist rose gently from the fields, curling around the roots of the old trees, and the people gathered again beneath the great oak, their hearts lighter yet restless. The teacher sat upon a low stone, hands folded loosely in his lap, as if waiting for something unseen. Elior, still carrying his blank parchment, took his usual place near the front. Around him, villagers whispered softly, each wondering what the next lesson hall might bring. The teacher lifted his head and looked at them with eyes that seemed to see through time. "Today," he said quietly, "I will tell you of a traveler and his burden." The crowd hushed. Even the birds stilled their song. "There was once a man," the teacher began, "who carried a stone wherever he went. It was not small, heavy enough to strain his back, yet he would not set it down. People asked him why he bore it, and he would say, 'It reminds me of my mistakes, so that I never repeat them.' When he slept, he used it as his pillow. When he walked, it bent his spine. Years passed, and he grew older, not from time, but from weight. The teacher picked up a small pebble from the ground and rolled it gently between his fingers. One day, the man met a child on the road. The child saw the stone and asked, 'Why do you keep something that hurts you?' The man frowned. 'Because if I let it go, I might forget what I did.' The child thought for a moment, then said, 'Maybe remembering doesn't have to hurt.' But the man shook his head. 'Pain is the only truth I trust.' A breeze passed through the clearing. The teacher placed the pebble in his palm and held it out to the crowd. 'Tell me,' he asked, 'was the man wise or lost?' An old farmer raised his hand. 'He was afraid,' he said softly. 'He thought guilt was the same as repentance.' The teacher smiled faintly. 'Yes,' he said, 'and so he worshipped his wound.' He mistook carrying the stone for healing it, but what he did not know was that forgiveness is not forgetting, it is freedom. He stood and began to walk slowly among them, the sun catching on his wet robe from the morning dew. 'Each of you carries a stone,' he said, his gaze meeting one face after another. 'Some are heavy with anger, some with shame, some with the names of people you no longer speak to. You call it responsibility or justice or memory, but it is the same stone. You polish it, you justify it, you call it necessary, yet it still breaks your back.' A young man in the crowd clenched his fists. 'But teacher,' he said, 'if someone wrongs us and we forgive too easily, does that not make us weak?' The teacher turned to him, eyes steady and calm. 'To forgive is not weakness. It is to set down what poisons you so that your hands are free to build again. The one who refuses forgiveness becomes like the man with the stone, strong in appearance, but too tired to walk forward.' He paused, lifting the small pebble once more. 'Tell me,' he said softly, 'how far can one travel when their arms are full?' The crowd was silent. A woman's voice trembled from the back. 'Teacher,' she said, 'what if the stone I carry is not from another's hand but my own? What if I cannot forgive myself?' The teacher's eyes gentled. 'Then you must listen carefully,' he said. 'When you refuse to forgive yourself, you call yourself judge and prisoner. In the same breath, you build the cell, lock the door, and then beg heaven for rescue, all while holding the key.' Tears welled in the woman's eyes. She sank to her knees. 'But how do I begin?' 'By setting it down,' he replied simply. 'Not because you have earned it, but because you were never meant to carry it.' He knelt beside her, lifting her hand and placing the pebble within it. 'This is not your punishment,' he whispered. 'It is your reminder that pain can teach, but not when you refuse to let it go. The moment you release what you've carried, it becomes a seed instead of a stone. Something new can grow there.' The woman stared at the pebble for a long time, then closed her fist around it and pressed it to her heart. 'It feels lighter already,' she said through her tears. The teacher rose and looked over the gathered faces. 'You see,' he said, 'freedom does not wait for you to be ready. It waits for you to be willing.' A quiet stillness settled over the clearing. The people breathed slower, as if the air itself had become easier to carry. Some looked at the ground, others at the sky, but all felt something shift within them, something they had long believed immovable. The teacher walked back to the stone where he had been sitting and placed the pebble beside it. "One stone teaches weight," he said softly. "The other teaches release. Choose which one you wish to learn from." Elior wrote the words down, not with ink, but with the still rhythm of his heart. For the first time, he understood that learning did not come only through thought, but through letting go. The teacher's gaze lifted toward the horizon, where a single bird took flight into the morning sky. He smiled faintly. "When the soul is unburdened," he said, "even wings grow where once there was only pain." The woman who had spoken wiped her eyes and looked up at him again. "And what of those who hurt others, teacher?" she asked quietly. "Can they be forgiven too?" He looked at her, the light of the rising sun reflected in his calm expression. "They can," he said. "But forgiveness begins not with what they deserve, but with what your heart cannot bear to keep any longer." The crowd absorbed the words like soil receiving rain, quietly, deeply. The teacher turned his gaze back to the woman and said gently, "Now tell me, child, what is heavier, anger or love?" She closed her eyes, the answer rising not from her mind but from somewhere far beneath it. "Anger," she whispered. The teacher nodded. "Then you already know which to keep." He turned once more toward the stream that flowed nearby, its water gleaming beneath the morning sun. "Come," he said softly, "let us walk beside the water once more. There is something yet to learn about rest, and a woman who has forgotten how to find it." The sun was beginning to lean westward, painting the sky with streaks of gold and rose. The teacher and his followers had settled near the edge of the stream, where reeds swayed softly in the breeze. The sound of the water was gentle, soothing, like a song meant for tired souls. Yet among those gathered, one woman seemed untouched by the calm. She sat apart from the others, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her cloak, never still. The teacher watched her quietly as he spoke to the others about peace, about the freedom that comes when one learns to trust what cannot be seen. But his gaze lingered on her, sensing the storm she carried inside. After a while she rose to leave, perhaps ashamed that the serenity around her did not reach her heart. But before she could go, the teacher called gently, "Mara." Her steps froze. No one had spoken her name since her husband's death. No one but her own voice whispered in grief. She turned slowly, her eyes wide. "How do you know me?" she asked, her voice barely more than breath. The teacher's expression was kind but steady. "The weary are always known," he said. "Sit with me." She hesitated, but something in his tone, neither command nor request but invitation, pulled her back. She lowered herself onto the grass before him. The others fell silent, sensing something sacred unfolding. "Mara," the teacher said softly, "why do you run from rest?" She blinked, confused. "I do not run," she said. "I simply cannot stop. There is work to do, mouths to feed, debts to repay. My life, it cannot afford stillness." He nodded slowly. "Then you are like the sea in a storm, endlessly moving, yet going nowhere." Her lips trembled. "If I stop, I will drown in what I feel. The memories, the loss, the fear, they chase me when I sit still." The teacher looked toward the stream, watching the current glide around the stones. "And yet," he said, "the water still reaches the sea." Mara frowned. "What do you mean?" "The stream does not rush out of fear," he said. "It moves with purpose, but also with surrender. It trusts the slope of the earth to carry it home. You, too, must trust that the path beneath you leads where you are meant to go. Rest is not the absence of movement. It is the presence of trust." Tears welled in her eyes. "I do not know how," she whispered. "I have prayed, but peace will not come." "Peace," said the teacher, "is not something that comes to you. It is something you uncover when you stop fighting what already is." He reached into the stream and cupped a handful of water, letting it fall through his fingers. "You see this? The water does not cling to the hand that holds it. It passes freely. so must your heart release what it cannot keep. Mara's breath caught in her throat. But I lost everything. My husband, my home. If I let go of even the grief, what is left of me? The teacher looked into her eyes, and his voice lowered to a tender whisper. What is left, he said, is you, the part of you that was never lost, the part that grieves because it loved, the part that endures because it still hopes. She began to cry then, her sobs breaking softly into the sound of the water. The people bowed their heads, the moment too fragile for words. The teacher let her weep, saying nothing, only watching as the tears mingled with the stream beside her feet. When her crying slowed, he spoke again, not as a preacher, but as one who understood. You think rest is weakness, he said, but rest is what keeps the world alive. The seed rests before it grows. The moon rests in darkness before it shines. Even your heart rests between every beat. Rest is not escape. It is the rhythm of creation. Mara lifted her face, her cheeks streaked with tears and the faint glimmer of understanding. Then rest is not something I must earn? The teacher smiled. It is something you were made for. The crowd listened, still and reverent. Even Ellier's hands paused mid-note, his quill hovering above the parchment. The teacher placed his hand over Mara's trembling fingers. Be still, he said. Not because your troubles have ended, but because you do not walk them alone. For the first time in many years, Mara closed her eyes without fear. She took a deep breath, the kind that sinks deep into the soul, and exhaled as though releasing a lifetime of burden. The teacher watched as her shoulders softened, her hands relaxed. Around them, the world seemed to quiet, the trees, the water, even the wind, all resting with her. After a long silence, she opened her eyes again. It feels like the world stopped, she whispered. The teacher nodded. It hasn't stopped, he said. You've just begun to move with it. The people smiled softly. Mara pressed her hands together and whispered, Thank you, teacher. He stood then, his robes brushing the damp grass, and looked out over the valley, now bathed in the last light of the day. Rest, he said, his voice carrying across the field, is not found in the end of labor, but in the turning of the heart toward peace. Seek it not in your hands, but in your breath. The crowd watched as the teacher lifted his scroll and walked toward the oak once more. The sky had deepened to a soft indigo, the first stars trembling in its vastness. He unrolled the parchment and held it gently as if it were the night itself. As the people gathered close again, the teacher began to read, not from his own words this time, but from the ancient writings of those who came before. His voice carried across the quiet evening like the hush between heartbeats, steady and luminous. And as he read, Mara listened, not to memorize, not to understand, but simply to rest. The last light of day stretched across the clearing, casting long shadows from the oak's branches. The people gathered close, drawn not only by the teacher's presence but by something deeper, an ache within them, that longed to be healed by the sound of truth. The stream murmured nearby, steady and sure, and the faint scent of wet soil still lingered in the cool evening air. The teacher sat beneath the oak with his scroll open before him. The parchment, worn and soft from use, caught the flickering light of a single lantern. His fingers brushed over the words, ancient and familiar, as though greeting old friends. He looked up, meeting the eyes of those seated around him, faces young and old, weathered and hopeful, all illuminated by the gentle glow of dusk. These words, he began, were written long before any of us drew breath. They come from hearts that sought peace when the world knew only despair. Listen not as though they belong to another time, but as though they are being spoken to you now. He began to read, his voice low and measured, each syllable falling like rain upon thirsty ground. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. The people sat in silence, the rustle of leaves mingling with his words. Every phrase felt alive, breathing through the air as if the earth itself repeated it back in echoes. Comfort, comfort my people, he continued, says your God. Speak tenderly to the weary heart and proclaim that its warfare is ended." He paused, letting the weight of the words rest upon them. The villagers' eyes glistened, not from sadness, but from the strange peace that comes when one realizes they have been spoken to all along. "These voices," the teacher said softly, "believed in a world they would never see. Their hope was not in the ending of sorrow, but in the promise that light would always find its way through." Elior, seated close enough to see the ink marks on the parchment, whispered to himself as he listened. The teacher's tone wasn't one of instruction, but of remembrance, like someone remembering the melody of an old song. The people leaned forward, drawn in, not by the sound of authority, but by the presence of love. He continued reading. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The words felt close, too close, as though they were unfolding before their very eyes. The teacher closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence breathe between them. "These words," he said finally, "were written in longing, but they are fulfilled in love. The voice that spoke then is the same that speaks now. The difference," he smiled gently, "is whether we have learned to listen." The crowd sat unmoving, each person lost in their own reflection. Some thought of old wounds, others of mistakes or fears long buried, yet none felt condemned. The words had washed over them like light through mist, revealing, not scolding. The teacher lowered the scroll slightly and looked at the people before him. "The prophets did not write to be remembered," he said. "They wrote because they heard something worth passing on. They were not men of power or perfection, but of patience. They listened when the world refused to." He glanced upward. A single leaf, loosened by the wind, drifted downward and landed upon the open scroll. He smiled, brushing it aside with care. "Even the leaves seem to understand," he said softly, "that to fall at the right time is not loss, but purpose." The crowd smiled faintly, some chuckling through their reverence. The teacher continued, his tone warm as a hearth. "When you read these words, do not chase their meaning as if it hides from you. Let them rest upon your heart. Truth does not demand to be understood. It invites you to sit beside it." Elior lowered his head, his chest tight with emotion. The lesson was not just about scripture, it was about life itself. How often had he chased meaning, desperate to capture it in ink instead of letting it live within him? The teacher rolled the scroll gently, tying it closed with a thin strip of linen. The air felt lighter now, as though something sacred had been released into it. A small voice broke the silence. It belonged to a young boy sitting cross-legged near the front, his eyes wide and curious. "Teacher," he asked softly, "why do you read if you already know what it says?" The teacher turned to him, eyes glimmering with quiet joy. "Because," he said, "even when I know the words, I still long to hear the voice that first spoke them." The boy tilted his head, puzzled but fascinated. "Whose voice is that?" The teacher looked toward the darkening sky. "The voice that teaches all who still wonder," he replied. "The same voice that whispers in the rustling leaves, in the flow of water, in the silence after sorrow. The voice of the one who still speaks, though few choose to listen." The boy smiled, though he didn't fully understand. The teacher reached out and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Curiosity," he said, "is the seed of faith. The moment you ask why, you have already begun to hear." The stars had begun to pierce the sky now, small and steady lights against the gathering night. The teacher stood, the scroll in his hands, and gazed upon the people who watched him in the growing dark. "Let your hearts remain open," he said softly, "for the world is full of questions, and heaven is full of answers waiting to be found, not by the proud, but by those who dare to wonder." The boy nodded eagerly, his eyes glimmering like one of the first stars. The teacher smiled and turned his eyes toward the horizon. The cool night wind swept through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth in autumn. And as the people settled into quiet reflection, the teacher began to tell them a story, not of stone or storm this time, but of wonder itself, and the way it leads every heart home." The crowd lingered in the hush that followed the boy's question. The teacher's face was soft with light from the lantern at his side, and his eyes carried that quiet spark that only appeared when truth was about to take shape. The boy waited, legs crossed, chin resting on his hands, his curiosity alive and unguarded. The teacher smiled, letting the silence breathe before speaking. "You ask why I read words I already know," he said gently. "Let me tell you of a man who once thought he knew everything worth knowing." The listeners leaned forward, their faces faintly illuminated by the flickering glow. Even the stream seemed to pause its murmur to listen. "There was once a man," the teacher began, "who believed that wisdom was a treasure buried deep within books. He owned many scrolls, parchments, writings of kings and prophets. He spent every day reading, every night memorizing. He could quote every law, name every scholar, and recite the lineage of kings without error. People called him the Learned One." The teacher's gaze drifted upward, following the stars now rising above the treetops. One evening, as he studied by candlelight, a moth fluttered close to his flame. The man waved it away, annoyed, but the moth returned again and again. Finally, in his frustration, he trapped it beneath his palm. But when he lifted his hand, he found the creature lifeless. Its wings had burned against the candle it sought. He paused. The man stared at it for a long time, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he did not understand. He whispered, "Why would you fly into the fire?" A small boy in the crowd frowned. "Because it didn't know better?" The teacher nodded slowly. That is what the man thought at first, but in the stillness of that night, he realized something deeper. The moth had not flown toward the flame to die, but to understand. It saw light and desired to know what it was, and in that desire, it gave itself completely. The people sat in silence, the meaning rippling through them like the stream nearby. From that day, the teacher continued, the man stopped reading to master wisdom. He began to seek it with wonder instead. He walked among the poor and listened to their laughter. He sat with children and asked them what they dreamed of. He looked at the stars and marveled that they still shone, though he could not name everyone. And in his unknowing, he found truth far greater than all he had memorized. The teacher's voice softened. Knowledge can fill the mind, but wonder fills the soul. The moment you believe you have seen all there is, you stop seeing it all. The young boy from before raised his hand. So wonder is like the beginning of faith? The teacher smiled. Yes. Wonder is the seed from which faith grows. To believe is to stand before mystery and say, even if I cannot see all of it, I know it is real. A woman in the crowd spoke quietly. But how do we keep wonder alive when the world feels so ordinary? The teacher looked at her with eyes that held the depth of the sea. By remembering that nothing ordinary is ever truly so. The rising sun, the beating heart, the breath that carries your voice, each is a miracle hidden in plain sight. The world has not grown dull. It is our eyes that have forgotten how to see. He reached down and picked up a small acorn lying in the grass. Holding it between his fingers, he said, "This tiny seed holds within it a forest. You could crush it beneath your heel and think it worthless, yet within it is the strength to split stone and reach the sky. Wonder is what allows you to look at this and see not what it is, but what it can become." Elior watched intently, feeling something shift in his chest. The teacher continued, "Children understand this far better than the wise. They look at clouds and see kingdoms, at rivers and see roads. Their faith is not built on proof, but on trust that beauty means something." The wind stirred again, lifting the leaves and carrying with it the faint scent of pine. The teacher let his gaze sweep over the faces before him, faces softened by awe, by remembrance of the child they once were. To wonder, he said quietly, is to be humble before creation. It is to bow not from fear, but from love. The heart that wonders cannot grow proud, for it knows there is always more to learn. He turned to the young boy. "Tell me," he said, "what do you think happened to the man after he learned to wonder?" The boy's brow furrowed as he thought, then his eyes lit up. He must have become like the moth. He found his own light. The teacher's smile widened. "Yes," he said, and in finding the light, he learned not to fear it. A long stillness followed. The teacher let it remain, for silence too was a kind of lesson. The sound of the stream returned, gentle and steady, mingling with the whisper of the wind in the branches above. The boy leaned against his mother's arm, his eyelids growing heavy. One by one, the villagers closed their eyes, not from weariness, but from peace. The teacher stood, looking at the stars now fully awake in the sky. His voice was low but strong. "Hold on to wonder," he said. "For when the world grows cold and reason fails, wonder will remind you that warmth is still possible." He rolled up the scroll and pressed it against his heart. "Tomorrow," he added softly, "I will tell you of something else that hides beneath the surface of the world. The strength that sleeps beneath hardship, waiting for its season to rise." The fire crackled quietly. The stars shimmered like eyes watching from above. And as the people drifted into silence, the stream beside them sang on, a lullaby of faith, guiding them gently toward the unseen depths where hope and patience take root. The next morning came colder than the last. Frost had crept quietly into the fields overnight, silvering the grass and tracing delicate patterns on every leaf. The air held a sharp stillness that bit at the skin, and yet beneath that chill, the teacher's presence warmed those who gathered once more beneath the old oak. They came wrapped in cloaks and blankets, their breaths rising like smoke into the pale dawn. The teacher stood near the edge of the field where yesterday's rain had gathered in small frozen pools. His eyes traced the earth, the veins of frost glinting like threads of glass across the ground. "The earth sleeps," he said, "but even in its silence, it is alive." Elior, notebook clutched tightly to his chest, frowned at the frozen soil. "But how, teacher? Nothing can grow in the cold." The teacher crouched, running his fingers gently over the frosted ground. "You only see the surface," he said softly. "Beneath this chill lies the seed, small, hidden, and waiting. It does not fear the frost. It rests, trusting the warmth that will come." He rose again, his breath visible in the cold air. "The seed beneath the frost is not dead. It only waits in faith, and so must you." The crowd listened quietly, shivering not only from the cold but from the weight of his words. A mother pulled her shawl tighter around her child, who whispered, "But why must it wait, if it could grow now?" The teacher smiled faintly. "Because not every season is meant for growing," he said. "Some are meant for becoming strong." He gestured toward the hills, their slopes covered in a thin layer of frost that shimmered beneath the morning light. The seed would break if it tried to bloom in the cold. It must wait, letting the frost teach it patience. When spring comes, it will rise, not because it fought the winter, but because it trusted the waiting. A man near the back shook his head slowly. "But how can one trust in waiting, teacher, when everything feels lost, when the heart is buried in its own cold?" The teacher turned to him, his eyes filled with quiet compassion. "You confuse stillness with death," he said. "When a heart grows quiet, it is not dying, it is listening. When life grows cold, it is not ending, it is preparing. Even the frost is part of the harvest." He knelt again, pressing his palm to the frozen earth. "Beneath here," he murmured, "there are thousands of seeds asleep. They do not shout or struggle. They do not beg for the sun to hurry. They trust that warmth will come because it always has." The people watched in silence, the words slowly thawing something inside them. Elior's breath fogged the air as he whispered, "So waiting can be a kind of faith?" The teacher's gaze lifted to meet his. "It is faith," he said, "the purest kind. For to wait without proof, to hope when the world is cold, that is the hate, strength that no storm can break." A hush fell over the field. The wind sighed softly through the branches of the oak, scattering a few last golden leaves across the ground. Then, suddenly, the stillness broke. From beyond the hills, a dark cloud began to gather. The air shifted. The cold deepened. A faint rumble of thunder rolled through the valley. The people looked to the teacher, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. He raised his hand gently. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The frost teaches patience, and the storm teaches faith." The first drops fell, not of rain, but of icy sleet that hissed against the ground. The crowd pulled their cloaks tighter, some huddling together, others shielding their children. The teacher stood unmoving, his robe whipping in the wind, his face calm. "Remember," he said, his voice rising above the gusts, "the seed beneath the frost does not curse the storm, it welcomes it, for the storm loosens the soil that once trapped it." Lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder cracked close enough to shake the earth. The villagers gasped, but the teacher simply looked upward, rain and sleet soaking his hair. "The world trembles not in anger," he said, "but in renewal. Even storms serve a purpose." Elior, holding his parchment against his chest, shouted over the wind, "Teacher, should we not seek shelter?" The teacher turned to him, smiling despite the storm. "Shelter is not found by running from the sky," he said. "It is found by standing firm beneath it." And then, as if on cue, the storm grew stronger. Rain mixed with hail, the sound of it drumming against the ground like 1,000 tiny fists. The crowd began to scatter toward the trees, their voices rising in confusion. The teacher remained where he stood, his arms slightly raised as if embracing the chaos. Through the roar of wind and rain, his voice carried, soft but certain. "Do not fear what shakes you. The earth must break before it can bloom." The sleet turned to pure rain, heavy and cold, soaking through every cloak and shawl. Elior hesitated, torn between seeking shelter and staying near. The teacher caught his gaze and nodded once. "Go," he said gently. "Learn what the storm has to say." Elior ran toward the others beneath the trees, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Behind him, the teacher remained, standing still beneath the torrent, his presence unmoved, unbroken. And as the wind howled through the valley, the frost began to melt, the ice turning to rivulets that fed the thirsty ground. Beneath the soil, unseen, seeds stirred for the first time in months, alive, awakened by both the cold and the rain. When Elior turned back, breathless, he saw the teacher walking slowly toward the stream, his scroll tucked beneath his arm, his steps steady despite the storm. The people followed from a distance, their fear easing into awe. The teacher reached the water's edge, rain streaming down his face, and looked at the soaked parchment he carried. Though the storm raged around him, he smiled faintly. "Even the written word must weather the rain," he said softly. "Let it test what is true." His voice, though quiet, carried through the storm like a steady flame, and the people began to gather once more, drawn toward the sound of peace amid the thunder. The storm came with a voice that seemed to shake heaven itself. The sky tore open in streaks of silver, and the earth answered with trembling. Trees bent low, their branches cracking under the weight of the wind, and the stream, once gentle, swelled with fierce current, spilling over its banks. The people scattered toward the shelter of the grove, clutching cloaks and children, calling out to one another through the roar. But the teacher did not move. He stood near the edge of the clearing, robes plastered against his frame, his hair heavy with rain. In his hands, he held the scroll, the same ancient words he had read beneath sunlight only hours before. Water streamed down his face, yet his expression remained calm, eyes lifted to the storm as though he were listening to it speak. Elior, shivering beneath a tree, watched in disbelief. "Teacher!" he cried, his voice half swallowed by thunder. "You'll be swept away. Come under the branches." The teacher turned his head slightly toward the sound, smiling through the storm. "Would you have me protect myself?" he called back, "and let what carries truth be ruined?" Elior froze, unsure if he spoke of the scroll or something far greater. The teacher knelt, shielding the parchment beneath his cloak while the rain pounded against his shoulders. Each drop hit with sharp rhythm, but he did not flinch. His fingers, though trembling with cold, gripped the scroll with care, keeping it dry while his body took the brunt of the storm. One of the villagers, an older man with a limp, approached cautiously, holding out a woven blanket. "Master," he shouted over the wind, "use this. You'll catch your death out here." The teacher looked up, his eyes illuminated by a flash of lightning. "Better I lose comfort," he said, "than let truth be washed away." The man hesitated, then bowed his head, lowering the blanket. The storm grew worse. Hail began to fall, pelting the ground with a relentless fury. Elior ran out from under the tree, shielding his head with his arms, and knelt beside the teacher. "Let me help you," he pleaded. The teacher turned to him, voice steady though the air screamed around them. "Then hold not the scroll," he said. "Hold the faith that it carries. That is what must never be lost." Elior's throat tightened. "But what if I am too weak to keep it?" The teacher smiled faintly. "Then you will learn that faith does not depend on your strength. It depends on your surrender." He lifted his gaze to the sky once more, rain running like tears down his cheeks. "The storm is not your enemy," he said softly. "It reveals what you truly value. It shows you what you are willing to protect." Elior looked down at his trembling hands and realized how tightly he was clutching the hem of his cloak. He let go. The teacher rose then, slowly, lifting the scroll high above his head as though offering it to the heavens. "The word endures," he said, his voice rising through the thunder, "not because it is untouched, but because it is carried through every storm." At that moment, the wind shifted. It howled once more, then broke apart, scattering into gentler gusts. The rain softened, its rage exhausted, falling now in steady rhythm like 1,000 sighs of relief. The clouds, bruised and heavy, began to drift apart, revealing a faint band of light along the horizon. The villagers emerged from the trees, blinking through the rain. They watched as the teacher unrolled the scroll and inspected it. Not a single word was lost. He smiled, the faint curve of joy breaking through exhaustion. "See," he said, "the truth remains. The storm only proved its worth." The people gathered around him, their faces wet and pale, some ashamed of having sought shelter, others simply awed. Mara, the woman who had once been unable to rest, stepped forward and said quietly, "You protected the word instead of yourself. Why?" The teacher looked at her kindly. "Because comfort passes quickly," he said, "but what gives life must endure. If I had saved myself, the lesson would be lost with me. Now you know that peace does not mean safety. It means trust." A faint golden light broke through the clouds, bathing the clearing in warmth. The steam rose from the soaked earth, and the smell of rain filled the air. The teacher looked upward, his eyes reflecting the faint glow. "When heaven sends rain," he murmured, "it is not to drown, but to cleanse. When it sends thunder, it is not to frighten, but to awaken." Elior, dripping and silent beside him, whispered, "Then every storm is holy." The teacher nodded. "Every storm teaches. It strips away the fragile things so that only what is true remains." The people slowly sat upon the wet grass, exhausted but calm, listening as the teacher spoke again. "Do you see now?" he asked. "The seed beneath the frost waited, the word beneath the rain endured. What matters is not the storm itself, but what survives after it passes." He raised the scroll gently, unrolling it once more. The pages glowed faintly in the pale, returning light. His voice, low and reverent, carried through the mist. "He who builds upon the rock need not fear the rain. The floods will come, and the wind will beat upon his house, yet it will not fall, for its foundation is truth." The villagers bowed their heads as he spoke, their hearts settling into a peace deeper than warmth could provide. The rain slowed to a whisper, then stopped altogether. A bird's cry broke through the silence, and with it came a breath of renewal. The air lighter, the colors of the world sharpened by the storm's passing. The teacher closed the scroll and set it upon the rock beside him. "Remember this," he said softly. "The word does not ask to be kept dry, it asks only to be carried." Elior gazed at him, the truth sinking deep. He looked to the scroll, then to the teacher, soaked, weary, but radiant, and something within him changed. He realized that faith was not about avoiding the storm, but walking through it with open hands. The teacher turned toward the group and motioned for them to gather close. "Now," he said, "let us build a fire. The cold has served its lesson, but warmth must have its turn." The villagers rose eagerly, gathering branches and dry reeds where they could find them. And as sparks soon rose into the damp air, their flames flickering to life, the teacher looked upon them with quiet joy, ready to speak of the next lesson, the one that waited beside the fire. The night had deepened into a quiet silver hush. The rain had passed, leaving the earth soft and steaming beneath their feet. The people gathered close, the scent of wet wood and smoke mingling in the air as they worked to build a fire in the center of the clearing. Their hands moved in silence, guided by the teacher's calm instruction. Twigs, bark, and damp branches were stacked carefully, and Ilyar struck flint against stone until a spark caught. At first, the flame was small, fragile, flickering, almost uncertain. It trembled in the darkness, struggling to live. The people leaned close, cupping their hands to guard it from the wind. Then, with a soft whoosh, it caught hold, climbing higher, breathing warmth into the chill night. A glow spread over their faces, tired, weathered, but peaceful. The teacher sat nearest the fire, its light painting gold upon his wet robe. His eyes reflected the flame, not with mere brightness, but with something eternal, something that seemed to know the heart of light itself. He stretched his hands toward the fire and said, "Look at it. The flame that warms you now is not born from power, but from patience. It burns because the wood yields to it. It gives itself, and in return it becomes light." Mara, seated beside the stream, watched the fire closely. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "but it burns what it touches." The teacher nodded. "So does truth." The crowd grew still again. Even the fire seemed to listen, its crackles quieting to soft murmurs. He continued, "Many seek light only to be seen by it. They wish to shine before others, to appear when holy, unshaken. But the true flame of understanding does not shout, it does not boast. It simply burns, quietly, steadily, without asking for praise. Enlightenment is not a blaze of intellect, it is a fire of love." A young shepherd spoke up, his hands held close to the warmth. "But teacher," he said hesitantly, "how can love be like fire? Fire destroys." The teacher looked at him kindly. "Only what refuses to change," he said. "Love burns away what is false. It consumes pride, anger, deceit. It leaves only what can endure, like gold refined in the furnace." Elior, his parchment still damp but protected by his cloak, listened intently, every word searing itself into his memory. He thought of the storm, of the teacher shielding the scroll while the rain struck his back, and he realized that love was not gentle because it avoided pain, it was gentle because it faced pain and did not retreat. The teacher leaned closer to the fire, feeding it with another branch. Sparks flew upward, vanishing into the night sky. "See how the flame gives light to all who sit near," he said. "It asks nothing, yet everything around it is changed. That is how understanding must live within you, not to make you greater, but to help you see more clearly." He turned to Elior. "What do you see when you look at this fire?" Elior hesitated, the flicker of flame dancing in his eyes. "I see warmth, light, life." The teacher smiled. "And if you stare too long?" Elior frowned, thinking, "It blinds." "Exactly," the teacher said. "Even truth, if held too tightly, can blind. Understanding must be shared, not hoarded. Fire locked away in a box suffocates. So does wisdom kept for oneself." A quiet murmur of reflection moved through the group. The fire crackled louder, throwing up brief bursts of orange that illuminated every face in the circle. They sat closer now, not from cold, but from longing, the kind of closeness that grows among those who have begun to understand. The teacher's gaze softened as he looked around the circle. "The heart," he said, "was made to hold this same flame. But unlike wood, the heart must choose to burn. You must allow love to consume what keeps you from peace. Then, and only then, will your light warm others instead of scorching them." Mara lowered her head. "And if we fear the burning?" "Then you fear the very thing that will set you free," the teacher answered. "The fire of understanding does not destroy you, it reveals you." The wind rose briefly, scattering embers into the air like stars. One landed upon Elior's parchment, leaving a small black mark. He brushed it away, but the teacher saw and said, "Do not hide that mark. Let it remain. It will remind you that truth always leaves its trace." Elior looked down at the burn and nodded silently. For a while they said nothing. The fire was enough, their faces warmed, their hearts eased. Some leaned against one another, their eyes heavy with weariness, but their spirits alert, anchored in the teacher's quiet presence. After a time, he spoke again. his voice low and calm, like a prayer carried on the wind. You have seen storms, and you have felt the frost. You have watched the seed rest beneath the cold and the word endure the rain. But now you see, the same power that moves water and wind also burns within you. It is not a force to be feared, but one to be trusted. He paused, gazing at the fire as it danced, and whispered, "When you understand this flame, you will know peace. For peace is not the absence of fire. It is learning to glow without consuming." The fire began to die down, its flames softening into embers that pulsed with gentle light. The teacher leaned back, his face half lit, half shadowed. Around him, the people rested quietly, their hearts filled with warmth that no storm could extinguish. Then, from the edge of the firelight, a figure appeared. A man, soaked and trembling, his clothes torn, his face streaked with dirt and shame. His steps faltered as he entered the circle of light, and his eyes fell upon the teacher. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some recognized him. He was one of their own, a disciple who had once followed closely but vanished days ago, leaving without word or farewell. Now he stood at the edge of the fire, unable to meet their gaze. The teacher looked up at him and spoke softly, "Come closer, child. Even a lost ember can burn again." And as the man fell to his knees, shivering and broken, the fire flared anew, as if welcoming him home. The man knelt at the edge of the firelight, his breath uneven, his hands trembling against the damp earth. The glow from the flames flickered over his face, revealing the marks of long travel, mud, exhaustion, and something heavier, shame. No one spoke. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, sharp and alive against the silence. The teacher looked upon him, his eyes neither stern nor surprised, but deeply calm, like a sea that had already forgiven the storm that once disturbed it. "You have walked far," he said quietly. The man's shoulders shook. "Too far," he whispered. "Far from you, and far from myself." The people shifted uncomfortably, some remembering his face. He had once been among them, a devoted listener, eager and full of words. But pride had led him away. He had left one morning without farewell, muttering that he no longer needed guidance, that he could teach himself what the teacher had to offer. And now he returned a ghost of the man he had been. "I thought I could find the truth on my own," he said, his voice breaking. "I wanted to know more, to do more. But everything I touched turned hollow. Every word I spoke felt empty, and when I tried to pray, I could not hear anything, not even silence." Tears began to stream down his face, cutting lines through the dust. "I have no right to stand among them," he said, gesturing toward the others. "I have failed you." The teacher rose slowly and walked toward him. The firelight wrapped around him like a mantle of gold and shadow. He knelt beside the man and placed a hand upon his shoulder. "You think failure is exile," he said gently, "but it is only the road that brings you home." The man lifted his eyes, wet and red-rimmed. "But I left you," he said. "I doubted you." The teacher smiled faintly. "And yet here you are." The words were simple, but they struck deep. The man lowered his head again, unable to hold the weight of grace. The teacher continued, "There is no shame in being lost, only in refusing to be found." He helped the man to his feet. The crowd watched, silent, unsure whether to rejoice or remain wary. The teacher looked around at them and spoke, his voice carrying the warmth of the fire. "Listen, all of you. A student who never falls cannot learn humility. A heart that never breaks cannot learn compassion. The one who wanders and returns knows the path twice and teaches others how to find their way back." The man covered his face, overcome. The teacher took his hand and led him closer to the fire. "Sit," he said. "You are not a stranger here." The fire crackled louder, as if approving. The man hesitated, then sank down beside it, the warmth soaking into his cold limbs. No one dared speak. The teacher sat opposite him, his eyes reflecting the flame. After a long silence, he said, "There was once a shepherd who had 100 sheep. One day, one wandered away into the wilderness. The shepherd left the 99 and searched the hills until he found it. When he did, he lifted it upon his shoulders, though it was heavy and stubborn, and he carried it home. When he arrived, he called his friends and said, 'Rejoice with me, for what was lost is found.'" The teacher's gaze met the man's. Tell me, he said softly, did the shepherd scold the sheep for straying? The man shook his head, tears spilling again. No. He rejoiced. Then why, the teacher asked, do you punish yourself more harshly than the shepherd? The man could not answer. The fire popped, sending a few sparks upward, and the teacher's hand rested lightly on the man's shoulder again. Do you see, he said. The shepherd's joy was not in the one that never left. It was in the one that returned. The words broke something open in the man's chest, something that had long been locked away. He wept freely now, not from guilt, but from relief. The teacher let him cry, saying nothing, his presence enough to steady the trembling soul before him. When the man's tears quieted, the teacher looked toward the others. Each of you, he said, has wandered in your own way. Some leave with their feet, others with their hearts, but no distance is too far for grace to reach. A murmur of emotion rippled through the crowd. Elior wiped his eyes quietly, feeling the truth sink deep into him. He looked at the man, this once proud student, and saw not disgrace, but redemption. The teacher rose, lifting his hands toward the sky. Understand this, he said, his voice carrying softly through the night. The lesson is not in perfection. It is in returning. Every soul that turns back to the light becomes a beacon for others still lost in shadow. The fire burned lower, glowing red and gold. The people drew closer together, warmth and forgiveness mingling in the air. The teacher stepped away from the circle and stood at the edge of the clearing, where the stars shimmered faintly above the dark horizon. The heavens, he said quietly, do not celebrate the stars that never fall. They rejoice in the ones that rise again. He turned back toward the man, who sat still before the fire, his hands open on his knees. You have fallen, the teacher said softly, and you have risen. You are no longer lost. You are learning. The man bowed his head, whispering through quiet sobs. Then let me learn to stay. The teacher smiled gently. Then stay and listen. He turned his gaze back to the crowd, his voice calm and steady once more. There are many who wander, he said. Some search for wisdom, others for belonging. But few understand that the greatest journey is not outward. It is the journey back. He looked toward the horizon, where mist began to rise from the valley floor, shimmering beneath the moonlight. Come, he said, gesturing for them to follow. There is something I wish to show you, a story written not in words, but in the fog that covers the earth and the light that still breaks through it. The people rose quietly, following him away from the fire, their footsteps soft upon the damp grass. And as they walked, the air grew cooler, the mist thickening around them, whispering like the breath of the unseen. Ahead, the faint glow of dawn waited, pale, uncertain, but real. The fog thickened as they walked. It drifted low over the valley, curling around their ankles, swallowing the path until only the faint outline of the teacher remained ahead. The fire's glow behind them had already faded into the mist, and the world seemed reduced to shadow and silence. Each breath came with a taste of cold earth and dew. The villagers followed close, their trust carrying them where their eyes could not. Elior clutched his parchment close to his chest, his other hand brushing the air before him, as if feeling for the unseen. Teacher, he called softly, how will we know the way if we cannot see it? The teacher's voice came from somewhere within the fog, not loud, but steady. You will not find the way with your eyes, he said. The path reveals itself to those who move forward, not to those who stand still in fear. Mara took a hesitant step, her foot sinking slightly into the wet soil. But what if we step the wrong way? She asked. The teacher turned toward her, his figure faintly visible, his robe a soft silhouette in the haze. Even a wrong step, he said, is still a step toward learning. They continued, the fog growing thicker until even the nearest faces blurred. The teacher stopped and raised his hand. From beneath his cloak, he pulled out a small lantern. Simple, made of brass and glass, its flames small, but sure. The light wavered in the mist, soft and golden, cutting through only a short distance, but enough. This, he said, holding it high, is what faith looks like. It does not chase away all darkness. It only lights the next few steps. The people drew closer, their faces glowing faintly in the warm circle of light. The fog swirled around them, dense and mysterious, but within that glow, there was safety. "Tell me," the teacher said quietly, "what do you see?" Elior squinted into the mist. "Only the path just ahead," he answered. "Good," said the teacher. "For that is all you are meant to see. Too much light blinds, too little leaves you frozen. The lantern gives enough for faith to move, but not enough for pride to lead." The crowd fell silent, listening. The teacher began to walk again, the lantern swinging gently in his hand. Its flame shimmered with every movement, steady despite the cold wind that passed through the fog. After a few moments, the teacher began to tell a story. His voice, low and rhythmic, seemed to carry through the mist like a thread guiding them forward. "There was once a traveler," he said, "who set out to find a city said to shine brighter than any star. He walked for days, through forests and fields, through deserts and storms. But one night, as he crossed a mountain pass, a great fog rose from the valley and swallowed everything. The man could no longer see the path, nor the stars above. Panic took him. He stumbled, fell, and cried out to the heavens, 'Have you brought me this far only to lose me here?'" The teacher paused. The only sound was the quiet hiss of the lantern flame. "Then," he continued, "the man noticed a faint light ahead, a lantern swaying in the mist. He followed it, step by step, though he could see nothing beyond it. The light moved slowly, as if waiting for him to keep pace. After a while, he grew weary and called out, 'Who carries the light before me?' But there was no answer, only the glow." Mara listened closely, her eyes wide. "Was it another traveler?" she asked softly. The teacher smiled. "Perhaps," he said. When dawn came and the fog lifted, the man found himself standing before the gates of the shining city. The lantern was gone. But when he looked down, he saw his own hand glowing faintly with warmth. Then he understood. The light he had followed had been his own faith reflected back to him. The people fell quiet. The words settled deep, as if they themselves had just walked through that same fog. Elior whispered, "So we carry our own light?" The teacher nodded. "Always. But it shines brightest when we walk beside others. Alone, it flickers. Together, it becomes a flame that can guide through any night." He turned slowly, the lantern still raised. "The fog is like the world. It hides what is certain so that you learn to trust what is eternal. The one who waits for clear skies will never move. But the one who walks through the mist with faith finds what eyes alone cannot." The air began to shift. The fog, heavy and thick moments ago, started to thin. The faintest blush of dawn appeared on the horizon, pale and trembling but growing stronger. The teacher lifted the lantern higher, and its glow mingled with the new light of morning. Mara let out a slow breath. "It's clearing," she whispered. "Yes," the teacher said, watching the fog dissolve into threads of gold and silver. "The world always clears for those who keep walking." As the mist lifted, the valley stretched out before them, green and glistening with dew, the river winding like glass through the hills. Birds began to sing, timid at first, then boldly. The people looked around, amazed, as though seeing the earth for the first time. The teacher lowered the lantern and extinguished its flame. "You see," he said, "the lantern was never meant to burn forever. It exists to lead you until you can walk by the light within." Elior stared at the extinguished lamp, its smoke curling upward. "Then faith," he murmured, "is not for seeing the end but for continuing the journey." The teacher's smile was faint but filled with warmth. "And now that you see the path again," he said, turning toward the river below, "you must learn what it means to cross it." The crowd began to follow him down the slope, their feet brushing through the last wisps of mist. The light of morning spread wider with every step, and the faint sound of rushing water grew louder, steady, constant, like the breath of the world itself. The fog was gone, but its lesson lingered. Sometimes, What hides the way is also what teaches how to find it. The valley shimmered in the first warmth of morning. Dew clung to every blade of grass, catching the sunlight like 1,000 tiny jewels. The stream that had raged under the storm now flowed quietly again, smooth and clear, winding its way through the field as if it too had learned peace. The people followed the teacher down the hill, their clothes still damp, their hearts lighter than they had been in many days. At the water's edge, the teacher knelt and dipped his hands into the stream. The ripples spread outward, breaking the perfect reflection of the sky. He looked up and said, "The world is full of great things, but it is the small ones that teach us how to love." Elior frowned, puzzled. "Small things?" he asked. "Like what, teacher?" The teacher cupped water in his hands and let it fall through his fingers. "Like this," he said. "The water does not boast, it simply flows, nourishing what it touches. Or the sparrow that rises at dawn, singing though no one may hear. Or the hand that reaches for another in kindness when no one is watching." Mara, standing nearby, smiled faintly. "But those things seem so little," she said softly. "Do they really matter?" The teacher turned his gaze toward her, his expression gentle, but serious. "They matter most," he said. "The kingdom is not built on thrones and crowns. It is built on crumbs of mercy, scattered by hands that do not seek credit. You call them little because you measure with pride, but heaven measures with love." A breeze stirred the reeds beside the water, bending them in rhythm like a bowing choir. The teacher stood and looked across the valley. "You seek great miracles," he said, "yet overlook the ones already before you. The sun rises without your asking, the heart beats without your will. Forgiveness given in silence is greater than praise shouted from rooftops." The crowd stood still, the simplicity of his words heavier than any grand teaching. Elior slowly unrolled his parchment, his ink-smudged fingers tracing the edges. He wanted to write, but somehow this truth didn't feel meant for paper. It was meant for practice. The teacher stepped closer to him and said, "Elior, what is written is remembered by the mind, but what is lived is remembered by the soul. Today, do not write. Help instead." Elior blinked in surprise. "Help whom?" The teacher gestured to the group. "Help each other." He then turned to the others. "Let this morning be one of small things. Share what you have. Speak gently. Listen fully. When you see someone burdened, lift what you can. For though your hands may seem weak, love multiplies like bread in the hands of the grateful." The people hesitated at first, unsure how to begin. Then, quietly, one woman took a piece of bread from her satchel and handed it to the child beside her. The boy, surprised, smiled and tore it in half, offering the other piece to the old man next to him. The act spread like a spark in dry grass. One gesture leading to another until the whole group moved with quiet purpose. A man who had long avoided his neighbor turned and offered his water flask. Two women who had not spoken since a quarrel exchanged soft words and laughter. A boy helped his mother untangle her cloak from the reeds. No one was commanded. No one sought to be seen. It simply happened, goodness growing where there had been hesitation. The teacher stood among them, watching. His eyes glimmered with a warmth that outshone the sunlight. "This," he said softly, "is the true miracle. Not that the sea can be parted or the blind made to see, but that hardened hearts can learn tenderness again." He crouched beside the stream once more and picked up a single pebble. A seed is small, yet it can split the ground. A spark is small, yet it can light a fire. Do not wait to do what is great. The great things of heaven begin as whispers on earth. Elior finally understood. He watched as the teacher dropped the pebble into the stream, the ripples expanding outward until they reached the opposite bank. "Even this," the teacher said, "will touch what you cannot see." The people fell silent again, humbled by the ease with which he found lessons in science. Everything. They had expected grand signs of power, but he showed them instead the sacredness of washing another's hands, of breaking bread without being asked, of giving warmth when none was deserved. Mara approached him quietly. "Teacher," she said, "I have no bread to share, only words of thanks." The teacher smiled. "Then give them freely. Gratitude is bread for the spirit." She bowed her head, her heart swelling with peace she hadn't known in years. Around them, the fog had lifted fully now, and the light of morning lay across the valley like a soft blessing. The teacher walked to the water again and looked across its surface, calm and gleaming. "You have learned to follow the light," he said, "but now you must learn to become it. Do not wait for the world to change. Be the reason it does." Elior's chest tightened as he listened. He had followed the teacher for many days, writing, observing, believing. But now, for the first time, he felt the weight of those words as a calling. Not to watch, but to live them. The teacher turned, his expression both peaceful and purposeful. "Come," he said. "There is more to see. The river flows beyond this valley, and there are hearts across the water waiting for what you have learned here." The villagers exchanged glances, hesitant yet eager. The teacher began to walk along the riverbank, the current glinting beside him like liquid light. The people followed closely, their footsteps soft upon the earth, carrying with them the warmth of the morning's kindness, the quiet flame of love that begins in small things. By midday, the sun burned gently through the scattered clouds, casting its gold across the valley. The teacher and those who followed him had reached a quiet meadow near the far bend of the river. Wildflowers swayed lazily in the breeze, and the air hummed with the soft chatter of life. Bees, grasshoppers, the rustle of small creatures moving unseen among the grass. The crowd gathered around him once more, some sitting on smooth stones, others kneeling in the shade of the willows. The peace of the morning still lingered in their hearts, though a faint murmuring had begun among them. A man dressed in fine linen approached from the edge of the clearing, his expression sharp with pride. It was the scholar from the nearby town, known to many for his eloquence and intellect. He had heard of the teacher and come not to learn, but to test. His sandals were clean despite the dust of the road, and his fingers clutched a scroll covered in neat, deliberate script. He bowed briefly, but without reverence. "Teacher," he said, his tone polite but cold, "I've heard that you speak of truth as if it were simple. Yet truth, as I've studied it, is a thing of complexity, earned only by years of thought and mastery. Tell me then, how can you offer truth to these simple people as though it were bread handed to children?" The crowd fell silent. A few looked to the teacher with unease, unsure if they should defend him. But the teacher did not speak right away. He gazed out across the field, his expression calm. A breeze moved through the grass, and in its stillness, a small sparrow fluttered down to the ground, landing just a few feet away. It hopped once, twice, pecking lightly at the earth. The teacher smiled faintly. "Tell me," he said to the scholar, "do you see that sparrow?" The man frowned. "Of course," he replied. "What of it?" The teacher turned his eyes toward the bird. "It searches for food without worry, builds its nest without learning, sings without being taught. Tell me, scholar, did the sparrow earn its place in the sky?" The man hesitated, uncertain of the question. "It is a creature," he said finally. "It acts on instinct. It knows no better." The teacher's eyes softened. "And yet it receives what it needs each day. It trusts the unseen to provide. It is fed without wisdom and clothed without understanding. But you, who have studied all your life, still hunger for peace." The words fell with a quiet weight. The scholar's lips parted, but no answer came. He looked down at the sparrow, now pecking near his feet, unconcerned with the silence that had seized the clearing. The teacher knelt and extended his hand toward the bird. It hopped closer, unafraid, then took flight, circling once above them before vanishing into the sky. The teacher watched it go, his gaze following its path. "You see," he said softly, "truth is not a treasure to be earned. It is a gift to be received. The more you try to own it, the less it belongs to you." The scholar's face darkened. "Are you saying my years of study mean nothing?" The teacher shook his head. "Not nothing. But knowledge without humility is like a well with no bucket, deep but unable to quench thirst." The crowd stirred, murmuring among themselves. Elior leaned forward, watching the man's face shift from anger to confusion to quiet shame. The teacher rose to his feet, dusting his hands lightly. "You have studied the scrolls," he said, "but have you ever listened to the wind? You have memorized the laws, but have you ever watched a seed break open to live? Truth is written in more places than parchment, scholar. The wise do not only read, they notice." The scholar lowered his eyes, his confidence faltering. "And what of my learning, teacher? What purpose does it serve if it cannot bring peace?" "It serves," said the teacher, "when it bows to wonder. Study gives you words, humility gives them meaning." The scholar stood still, eyes glistening, not with tears, but with the first glimmer of understanding. He looked again toward the sky, where the sparrow had disappeared, and for a moment his voice softened. "Then, perhaps I have been chasing the wind," he murmured. The teacher smiled gently. "Then stop chasing. Let it carry you instead." The man nodded slowly, hands loosening their grip on the scroll. With quiet reverence, he placed it on the ground beside the teacher and stepped back. "I came to test you," he said, "but I see now that I have only tested myself." The teacher inclined his head. "Every question you ask in pride becomes a mirror, but the moment you ask in humility, it becomes a window." The scholar bowed deeply this time, not out of duty, but from the heart. He turned and walked away, his steps lighter than when he had arrived. The crowd watched him go, their faces reflective, touched by something they could not name. Elior sat quietly, his mind turning with the weight of it all. He looked to the teacher and asked, "So truth cannot be taught?" The teacher's gaze met his, warm and knowing. "It can be spoken," he said, "but it must be heard with more than ears. Truth is not learned. It is revealed, like sunlight breaking through the clouds." The people sat in silence, the meadow alive once more with sound, the rustle of reeds, the hum of insects, the distant cry of a bird. The teacher stood, looking out over the flowing river, its current slow and steady beneath the light of noon. "Come," he said, his voice carrying over the water. "There is a village beyond this river, a place where hearts have grown heavy from labor and grief. There we will rest, and there you will learn how peace is shared." The people rose and began to gather their things, their hearts still caught between reflection and curiosity. The sound of the river beckoned, and as they followed the teacher toward its edge, the wind carried a single note of birdsong, a faint reminder of the truth that flies freely, asking nothing in return. The river gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, wide and steady, its surface carrying shards of light that danced and disappeared with the current. The teacher stood at the water's edge, sandals half submerged in the shallows. Behind him, the people gathered, weary from walking, their hearts heavy with what they could not name. The village he spoke of lay somewhere beyond the river, but none could see it from where they stood. Elior stepped forward first. "Teacher," he said, "how shall we cross?" The teacher turned to him with a calm smile. "One step at a time," he replied. Some hesitated, staring at the current, its ripples catching the sun like blades of glass. The stream was not deep, but it moved swiftly. Still, the teacher began to walk, the water swirling around his feet. The others followed carefully, their reflections trembling beside them. When they reached the opposite bank, the teacher paused and looked back at the river. "This," he said, gesturing toward the flowing water, "is how one returns to what is true. You cross from what you were into what you are meant to be, not all at once, but step by step. Some resist the current, others surrender to it. Both will reach the other side, but only one will know peace along the way." Mara nodded slowly, her wet skirt clinging to her legs. "And which one are we meant to be, teacher?" He smiled softly. "The one who remembers that the river does not flow backward." The people sat upon the grassy shore, wringing out their clothes, resting in the warmth of the sun. The teacher seated himself upon a smooth stone nearby, his robe still damp, his eyes distant, as though seeing a road invisible to everyone else. After a moment, he began to speak, not loudly, but with that quiet strength that drew every ear closer. "There was once a man," he said, "who lived his life walking away from home. Each step he took, he believed, brought him closer to something greater, fortune, wisdom, praise. But the farther he went, the emptier he became. The people he met praised his ambition, but his heart grew quiet and cold. One night, as he walked beneath a dark sky, he stumbled upon a pool of water and looked down. He saw his reflection and did not recognize himself. The teacher's gaze lifted toward the horizon, where clouds were beginning to gather again in soft gray folds. So he turned around, he continued, and began to walk back. He was ashamed at first, afraid of what others would say. But every step toward home made him lighter. The burden of his pride began to fall away. The weight of his wandering turned into rest. And when he finally reached his home, the door was still open, the fire still burning. He realized then that home had never moved. It was he who had. The crowd sat still. Even the river seemed to hush, its steady rhythm blending into the silence. Elier spoke quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Teacher, are we all walking away from home?" The teacher looked at him with compassion. "At some point, yes," he said. "Each of us leaves, not in body but in heart. We chase things that promise life and return empty-handed, but the path of peace is the path of returning, not to a place, but to the presence that never left you." He rose from the stone, walking slowly among them, his bare feet pressing softly into the damp soil. "Some of you carry regrets," he said. "Some carry wounds that time has not healed, and some carry pride disguised as strength. Yet all of these can be laid down when you turn back toward what is eternal. The moment you stop running, you begin to return." A hush fell over the group. The teacher's words were not heavy. They were healing. Mara looked at the river again, her eyes glistening. "And what if we have walked too far, teacher? What if the way back is lost to us?" He shook his head. "You cannot lose what leads to light," he said. "Even in the darkest valley, a single breath of repentance can open the road home. The map to peace is written within the heart. It only fades when you stop believing it exists." He turned toward the horizon, where the faint outline of the village could now be seen beyond the trees. "That is why we walk. Today," he said, "not to reach a place, but to remember where we came from." The people gathered their things and began to follow. The air smelled of earth and leaves. The sound of the river behind them softened as they climbed a gentle slope. The teacher led at a slow pace, each step deliberate, as if matching the rhythm of their hearts. As they walked, he spoke again, not in parables now, but as one speaking directly to the soul. "To return," he said, "is not weakness, it is wisdom. The world teaches you to move forward at any cost, but the Spirit knows when to turn around. You do not find peace by conquering the road ahead, but by reconciling with the steps behind you." They passed through a grove of olive trees, their branches whispering in the afternoon wind. The teacher stopped and touched one of the trunks, its bark smooth and ancient. "Even the tree knows how to return," he said. "Its roots dig downward as its branches reach upward. In growing, it remembers its beginning." Elier wrote the words quickly in his mind, though his hands held no parchment. He understood now that the greatest teachings were not those recorded in ink, but those carried in the heart. The teacher looked back at them once more, his face serene beneath the fading light. "One day," he said, "each of you will walk this road again, alone. When you do, remember this. Home is not behind you or before you. It is within you, waiting for you to stop long enough to knock." The wind picked up gently, scattering leaves across the path. The teacher smiled, his robe shifting with the breeze. Ahead, the first roofs of the village glimmered through the trees. "Come," he said, his voice soft yet certain. "We will rest here a while. There is a lesson waiting among the weary. A lesson written not in words but in hands that have forgotten how to let go." The afternoon light softened into amber as the group entered the forest that bordered the village. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches painted in shades of rust, ochre, and fading gold. Each step stirred a whisper beneath their feet, the dry murmur of fallen leaves shifting like the pages of an old book. The air carried that distinct scent of autumn, sweet, tired, and honest, as though the earth itself was exhaling after a long season of labor. The teacher walked ahead, his robe brushing the ground, the hem gathering specks of brown and gold. He said nothing for a time. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of their steps and the occasional cry of a crow echoing somewhere in the distance. Elier walked near the front, his eyes drawn to the swirling leaves that fell gently from the canopy above. "Teacher," he said softly, "the leaves fall every year, and yet the trees never weep. Why do they let go so easily?" The teacher stopped, turning slightly to face him. His eyes reflected the light that slipped through the trees. Because they trust what they cannot see, he replied. The trees do not mourn what is past. They release so that what is living within can rest and begin again. He bent down and lifted a single red leaf from the ground, holding it up between his fingers. Each leaf has known the wind, the rain, the warmth of the sun. It has served its purpose. To cling would be to deny the cycle that gives it meaning. Mara, walking a few paces behind, lowered her gaze to the path beneath her feet. But we are not trees, she said quietly. Letting go hurts us. The teacher nodded. Yes, because you mistake letting go for losing. The tree loses nothing. It exchanges. You must learn to release not from despair, but from trust. The heart, like the tree, must shed what is finished if it wishes to grow again. The people listened as they walked, the forest alive around them. The sunlight shifted with the breeze, making the leaves flicker like embers. Each one that fell landed without sound, disappearing into the blanket of others that already covered the earth. Elior watched them fall and whispered almost to himself, "Then perhaps this is what peace looks like, when even the dying is beautiful." The teacher smiled. Peace, he said, is not the absence of dying, but the presence of meaning within it. They continued deeper into the woods. The path narrowed, winding between tree trunks whose roots coiled like old veins through the soil. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmed as clouds gathered above the treetops. The teacher spoke again, his voice steady as though reading from a scroll unseen. Every soul walks through seasons. There is the spring of beginning, the summer of strength, the autumn of letting go, and the winter of stillness. But do not fear the seasons that strip you bare. The branches must empty before they can hold light again. Mara looked up at the sky through the tangled branches. Then autumn is mercy? She asked. Yes, the teacher said. Mercy disguised as loss. They walked on, the forest thickening around them. The sound of their footsteps blended with the wind, creating a quiet, living music that seemed to fill the air between each breath. For a while, no one spoke. The teacher's words lingered in their minds, settling like the leaves upon the path. At last, they reached a clearing. The trees opened to reveal a wide field carpeted entirely in leaves. In the center stood a stone structure, ancient, cracked, its walls wrapped in vines. It looked as though the forest had tried for centuries to reclaim it. The teacher stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked toward the ruin. Once, he said, this place was filled with song. Men built it to reach the heavens, but they forgot that heaven was already within their breath. He stepped forward, the sound of crushed leaves following him like a soft echo. The others hesitated, gazing at the structure with awe and unease. The pillars were broken, the roof half collapsed, yet a strange serenity lingered there, as if time itself had learned reverence. Elior approached and ran his fingers along one of the moss-covered stones. Was this a temple, teacher? Yes, he replied, but its walls fell when its worshippers forgot why they prayed. They built their altar too high and left their hearts too low. The wind stirred again, sweeping through the clearing and lifting a flurry of leaves into the air. They circled around the temple, glowing gold in the slanted sunlight. The teacher raised his eyes to them and said, "This is the lesson of the fallen leaf, that even what has fallen still dances when touched by the wind." Mara stepped closer, her gaze drawn to the doorway of the ruin. "Do you mean even what is broken can still serve a purpose?" The teacher looked at her with warmth. "Especially what is broken," he said, "for only the broken can let the light through." He began walking toward the temple's entrance, his steps slow and measured. The people followed, their eyes wide, their hearts trembling with the strange quiet of the place. Inside, shafts of sunlight cut through gaps in the roof, illuminating the dust that hung like mist. The air smelled of age and stillness. The teacher placed his hand upon one of the old stone walls. "This house has been forgotten," he said softly, "but not forsaken. Just as every soul that once sang here carries its echo still." Elior tilted his head, listening. At first he heard only the faint sigh of wind through the cracks, but then, perhaps from imagination or something beyond it, he thought he heard the faint hum of voices long past, a harmony older than memory. The teacher turned to face them, his eyes luminous in the dim light. "Now," he said, "we will sit among these stones, for the next lesson is not of walking or seeing, but of remembering, of the sacred that never truly leaves, even when forgotten." The people sat quietly, forming a circle among the fallen leaves that had drifted into the old temple's heart. Outside, the forest swayed, whispering softly as if bowing to the stillness within. The teacher closed his eyes, and the light above them shifted, warm, golden, eternal. And the world seemed to pause, waiting for what he would say next. Inside the old temple, silence reigned like a living thing. Dust floated through the shafts of golden light that streamed between cracks in the roof, each particle drifting in its own slow rhythm, timeless and deliberate. The air was still, so still that even the faintest breath seemed loud. The people gathered close, their movements cautious, as if afraid to disturb whatever presence lingered there. The teacher walked slowly toward the center of the room. His hand brushed against the stone walls, fingers tracing the carvings worn nearly smooth by centuries of touch. He stopped where the light met the floor, and there, beneath the fractured beam of sun, he knelt. "This," he said, quietly, "is the place where men once came to be seen by heaven. Yet heaven was never blind to them." Elior knelt as well, his gaze fixed on the teacher's bowed head. "It feels empty," he said softly, glancing around. "No altar, no music, no flame." The teacher nodded. "Yes," he said, "because even emptiness can be holy." The words drifted through the stillness and settled in their hearts. The people exchanged uncertain glances. Some closed their eyes, trying to feel the holiness he spoke of, but all they could sense was silence, the vast kind of silence that presses against the soul until it starts to tremble. The teacher continued, his voice a whisper that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. "When the temple was full of song, of sound, of sacrifice, it was easy to believe that God was here. But when the walls crumbled and the voices faded, he didn't leave. He only waited for them to listen." Mara looked down at her hands. "Then he waits still?" she asked. The teacher looked up, his gaze warm and steady. "He waits in every silence," he said. "The sacred is not lost when the song ends. It becomes the quiet between the notes." The people fell still again, as if struck by the beauty of what they could not quite name. The teacher rose and began to walk slowly through the room. His footsteps echoed softly, measured and unhurried. "Do you know why this place feels heavy?" he asked. No one spoke. "Because it remembers," he said. "Stone remembers the weight of prayer. The earth remembers the sound of forgiveness. Even the dust remembers footsteps of those who sought peace here." He stopped beside one of the broken pillars and rested his hand upon it. "You call this ruin," he said, "but heaven calls it resting." Elior frowned slightly. "Resting?" "Yes," said the teacher. "For even what was once great must rest, as all living things must. The temple served its purpose, and now it teaches through its stillness." The wind stirred gently through the cracks in the wall, carrying the scent of rain. The teacher turned his face toward it and closed his eyes. "This air," he said, "is the same that once filled these halls with song. What was sacred then is sacred now. The only difference is the noise we add to it." He looked to the people seated around him. "The heart is not so different from this place. It builds walls, raises altars, fills itself with words and prayers. But when those walls fall, when the heart grows quiet, then the true presence is revealed." A long silence followed. The group sat motionless, listening, not to him, but to the faint whisper of air moving through the ruin. It was not the silence of absence, but of fullness. Like the pause before creation speaks again, Mara was the first to break the stillness. "Teacher," she said softly, "how do we keep such silence in a world that never stops speaking?" He smiled gently. "By choosing what not to answer," he said. "Every voice you silence within yourself, every worry, every argument, every fear, becomes a space where peace may dwell. The soul must learn to be a sanctuary, not a marketplace." He moved back toward the center of the temple and lowered himself to his knees once more. "Sit," he said quietly. "Listen not for words, but for the space between them. That is where truth hides. The people obeyed, forming a circle around him. For a time there was nothing but breath, the quiet rhythm of life itself. And then, without command, something happened. One by one, they began to weep, not from sorrow, but from release. The silence had broken them open. Elior felt tears streak down his face as he realized how long he had carried his noise within him, the clamor of doubt, ambition, and fear. He placed his hand upon the stone floor, cold and smooth beneath his fingers, and felt the pulse of something eternal there. It was faint, but real, like a heartbeat buried deep within the earth. The teacher opened his eyes, his expression serene. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "This quiet is not emptiness, it is presence. What you hear now is what the world sounds like when you stop shouting at it." The wind sighed through the cracks again, brushing across their faces. The golden light dimmed as a cloud drifted across the sun, softening everything to silver. The teacher stood and looked toward the open doorway. "You have heard what cannot be spoken," he said. "Now you must learn to carry it with you." He walked toward the exit, and the others followed, their movements slow, reverent, as though leaving a dream they were not ready to wake from. Outside, the forest stretched wide beneath the fading light, the air cool and fresh with the scent of rain. At the threshold, the teacher turned back once more and said, "Remember, every silence you honor builds a temple within you. Carry it into the noise of the world, and let peace make its home where words cannot." He stepped out into the open air, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Soft, scattered, cleansing. The people emerged behind him, their faces lifted toward the sky. None spoke. They didn't need to. The forest around them shimmered with quiet, and as the rain deepened, the teacher began walking down the narrow path that led toward the waiting village. The sound of their footsteps blended with the rhythm of falling water, steady and sure, like a heartbeat guiding them forward toward what waited beyond the trees. The rain had stopped by the time the sun began to lower beyond the hills. The forest had thinned into a dirt road lined with tall reeds and pale stones, leading toward the small village the teacher had spoken of. Smoke rose in thin lines from a handful of clay chimneys, curling gently into the cool evening sky. The scent of wet earth clung to the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of bread baking somewhere unseen. The people walked quietly behind the teacher, still holding onto the peace of the ruined sanctuary they had left behind. Their footsteps were soft, the kind that matched the rhythm of thought more than motion. As they neared the village gate, little more than an arch of wood and stone, a man stood waiting. He was tall, wrapped in a dark cloak that looked heavy from travel. His face was sharp, his beard untrimmed, his eyes hard as flint. In his right hand he held a walking staff, in his left a small leather pouch. When he saw the teacher and his followers approach, he straightened, planting his staff firmly in the ground. "You there," he called, his voice deep and rough. "You're the one they speak of, the preacher who claims the wind carries wisdom and rivers whisper truth." The teacher stopped a few steps from him. The people behind him hesitated. The stranger's tone was not one of curiosity but challenge. The teacher met his gaze without anger. "I have spoken only what I have seen," he said calmly. The man scoffed. "Seen?" he repeated. "The world does not need poets wandering from place to place speaking riddles. It needs answers. It needs power. Tell me, can your words fill a man's stomach? Can they rebuild a broken home?" A few of the villagers who had gathered at the gate muttered softly. The teacher stood still, his eyes warm but steady. "Words do not fill," he said, "but hearts that understand them do." The stranger stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "And if a man refuses your words, what then? Will your peace feed his hunger?" The teacher looked down at the pouch in the man's hand. "You carry bread," he said softly. "Will you share it?" The question caught the man off guard. He clutched the pouch tighter, eyes narrowing. "This?" he said. "I earned it. The road is long and my hunger is my own to manage." The teacher nodded. "Yes, and yet you asked if words can feed. Perhaps we can see together." He turned slightly and motioned to Mara, who had been standing quietly among the crowd. Bring what you carry, he said. She stepped forward, opening her satchel. Inside were 2 small loaves, rough and uneven, baked hastily that morning. She looked at him uncertainly. It isn't much, she said. It will be enough, he replied. He gestured toward a flat stone near the gate and knelt beside it. Come, he said to the stranger, sit and eat with us. The man hesitated, suspicion warring with curiosity. The teacher's tone carried no force, no pleading, only simple invitation. Slowly, the man lowered himself to the ground, still gripping his pouch. The teacher broke one of the loaves in half and placed a portion upon the stone. Then, he looked at the man again. You asked if peace can fill a stomach, he said. Let us find out. The stranger's brow furrowed. I do not understand what game you play. There is no game, said the teacher. Only fellowship. Share what you have, and I will share what I have. The man hesitated, then untied his pouch. Inside were coarse pieces of bread, slightly stale but still edible. He placed one beside the teacher's loaf. The teacher smiled faintly, took both, and divided them evenly among those gathered. When the bread reached the man again, it was warm, warmer than before, though no fire had touched it. He looked at it in wonder, then at the teacher, whose expression was calm and knowing. The teacher said quietly, when you hold what you have too tightly, it remains small. But when you give it, even the smallest thing multiplies. The man stared down at the bread in his hand. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he began to eat. The people followed, eating in silence, the air filled with the simple sound of nourishment. There was no miracle that could be seen, no flash of light, no thunder, but something unspoken passed among them, something that filled more than hunger. When they had finished, the man looked up again. His face softened. You have strange ways, teacher, he said quietly. You answer questions not with words, but with your hands. The teacher smiled. Hands speak when mouths forget how. The man stood, brushing crumbs from his cloak. He looked at the people around him, these wanderers, calm and content despite the dust on their feet and the weariness in their eyes. He opened his mouth, then stopped, his pride faltering. I came to argue, he admitted. Now I'm unsure what I came for. The teacher rose as well. Perhaps to be reminded, he said. The truth does not shout to be proven. It waits to be lived. The man bowed his head slightly. His eyes lingered on the teacher for a long moment before he turned to go. But as he stepped through the gate, he stopped and looked back once more. If I were to seek you again, he said, where would I find you? The teacher looked toward the village beyond the gate. Wherever there is need, he said. Wherever a stranger is welcomed as a friend. The man nodded slowly, then walked into the dusk, his figure fading down the road until he was no more than a shadow. The teacher turned to the others. Do you see? He said softly. The gate is not only a doorway, it is a meeting place. The world divides by fear, but love meets in the middle. Elior watched the spot where the stranger had vanished, his chest warm with something he could not name. He came with anger, he said, and left with peace. The teacher nodded, because the heart cannot hold both. He looked toward the village where the first lanterns were being lit. Come, he said. The weary wait beyond these walls. Tonight, we will rest and learn how light is shared. The village welcomed them with quiet curiosity. The people there were not unkind, only tired, the kind of weariness that sinks beneath the skin and takes root in the soul. Their days were long, filled with work that never seemed to end, and their nights were too short for dreams to bloom. When the teacher arrived with his followers, the villagers paused in their routines, looking up from their tasks as if unsure whether they were witnessing something real or imagined. The teacher spoke to no one at first. He only smiled, greeting them with the calmness of one who carried no demands. By evening, a small crowd had gathered in the open square where the old fountain stood. The water within it was still and murky, reflecting the amber sky of a fading day. The teacher stood beside it, the light falling softly over his shoulders. He held a scroll, worn at the edges and marked by time. When he unrolled it, the hush deepened. The sound of the paper unfurling echoed like a breath across the square. Children sat near the front, their small hands clasped around their knees, while elders leaned forward, drawn by something they didn't yet understand. The teacher began to read. His voice was gentle but strong enough to carry through the air. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The words settled over the people like the slow descent of dusk, familiar to some, foreign to others, but steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. He read not as one reciting from memory, but as one conversing with each syllable, giving breath to the ancient rhythm of peace. When he finished the passage, he lowered the scroll and looked around at the faces before him. "These are not merely words," he said softly. "They are doors. Each one opens to a place within you, a place untouched by fear." An old woman near the back raised her trembling hand. "But fear feeds us now," she said, her voice cracking. "Fear keeps us working. Fear keeps us alive." The teacher nodded. "Yes, fear sustains the body, but it starves the soul. You were not made to live from fear. You were made to live from peace." He turned to the fountain and touched the water with his fingertips. "Peace," he said, "is like this water. When it is still, it reflects the heavens, but when stirred by the winds of worry, it loses its clarity. Your heart is the same." The crowd fell silent again, the metaphor landing deep. Elior, standing near the back, could see how some of the villagers lowered their eyes, as though ashamed to find their own reflections in his words. The teacher then looked up toward the hills beyond the village, their outlines dark against the orange sky. "You have labored long," he said. "You have built your homes with your hands, but your hearts remain homeless. You toil for survival, yet forget to rest in what already sustains you. Tonight, we will rest together." He gestured for them to sit. The villagers obeyed hesitantly, forming a rough circle around the fountain. The teacher sat as well, placing the scroll upon his lap. The air was cooling now, carrying with it the scent of bread and wood smoke from the nearby houses. The first stars began to appear, faint and scattered, as the last of the daylight faded. He began to speak again, not reading now, but teaching in the quiet tone of one speaking directly to the soul. "There was once a shepherd," he said, "who found that his flock had wandered. He called for them through the night, but the wind carried his voice away. When morning came, he climbed the highest hill, and from there he saw them scattered in the valley. So he descended, not with anger, but with patience, for he knew that the lost are not stubborn, only frightened." A murmur passed through the crowd, one of recognition. Many among them had wandered in their own ways, from faith, from kindness, from hope. The teacher continued, "Peace is not found in stillness alone. It is found in the courage to return again and again to where you belong. Even if the road back is long, it is always waiting." He paused then, and for the first time, he smiled, softly, as the night fully embraced them. The villagers, once restless, now seemed to breathe in unison. The tension that had lived in their shoulders began to ease. A few wiped tears from their faces quietly, as though afraid to disturb the moment. The teacher looked at them and said, "Now you have heard my story, but peace grows best when it is shared. Tell me yours." The words hung in the air, and for a time no one spoke. Then, slowly, an old man leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on his knees. "I have worked the same field for 40 years, he said, "and every year I fear it will not bear fruit. I pray, but I do not trust. I think maybe I forgot how." The teacher met his gaze. "You did not forget," he said gently. "You only grew tired. Rest is not the end of faith. It is its renewal." Encouraged, others began to speak. A young mother shared her fear of losing her child to sickness. A widow spoke of her loneliness. A farmer confessed his anger at the drought. Each story was a release, and with every confession, the night seemed to lighten, the stars above them glowing brighter. The teacher listened to each one, not with judgment, but with patience so deep that even the earth seemed to lean closer. When all had spoken, he said quietly, "Peace does not silence your pain. It gives it purpose. When you speak what burdens you, the wound begins to breathe, and when it breathes, it begins to heal." The crowd sat in stillness again, the fountain's water glinting softly in the moonlight. The teacher looked around the circle and said, Keep speaking, even when no one answers. Heaven always listens. Then he rose to his feet, the scroll once again in his hand. Tomorrow, he said, we will walk to the fields together. There is something the earth wishes to show you, how even in its labor, it never forgets to rest. The people remained seated as he walked toward the darkened path beyond the square. The last light of dusk caught the edge of his robe, turning it gold for a moment before it faded into the night. The next morning dawned soft and pale, the light spreading gently across the fields that framed the village. Mist drifted low over the ground, clinging to the grass like a veil, and the sound of birds returning from their nests filled the air. The teacher stood at the edge of the square where they had gathered the night before, his eyes turned toward the awakening earth. One by one, the villagers came from their homes, some still rubbing sleep from their eyes, others already dressed for work, yet none picked up their tools. They gathered again, forming a circle around him, their hearts still carrying the peace of the previous night. For a while, no one spoke. The silence between them was not awkward. It was alive, like the hush before a song begins. Then, from among them, the old man who had spoken first the night before stood up. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed them together in front of his chest. "Teacher," he began, his voice low but clear. "Yesterday, when you read from the scroll, something in me broke open. I did not know that fear had built a wall in my heart until your words showed the cracks. Last night, I prayed, not with words but with tears, and when I woke, I found I was not afraid of my field. For the first time, I wanted to step into it with gratitude instead of dread." The teacher smiled gently. "Then your soil has already been blessed," he said. The old man bowed his head and sat down. The crowd murmured softly, the sound like the rustle of wind through dry leaves. Then a woman rose, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes still red from crying. "My son has been ill for weeks," she said, her voice breaking. "I have begged heaven for mercy and cursed heaven for silence. But last night, when you said that heaven listens even when no one answers, I felt something loosen in me. I sat beside my boy until the stars faded. I spoke to heaven again, not in anger, but in trust. And this morning, he opened his eyes." Gasps spread through the crowd. A few turned toward her home as though expecting to see the child appear. The teacher did not look surprised. He stepped forward, his voice soft as the mist that drifted between them. "Love is the first medicine," he said. "When faith returns, the body remembers how to breathe." The woman wept openly now, covering her face, and those nearest to her placed their hands gently on her shoulders. A young man stood next, his clothes torn from labor, his face hardened by years of struggle. "I am not a good man," he said bluntly. "I have cheated, shouted, and lied. I thought no light could reach me. But when you spoke of the shepherd who did not scold his lost sheep, I saw myself in that story. I thought I was too far gone." He paused, looking down at his rough hands. "But if the shepherd can still call my name, then I will answer. I do not know how to pray, but I want to begin." The teacher's gaze met his. "The first word of prayer," he said, "is not spoken. It is the turning of the heart. You have already begun." The crowd listened, some nodding, some silently crying. Each word that passed between them seemed to lighten the air around them. Then, from the far edge of the circle, the village blacksmith stepped forward, wiping soot-stained hands on his apron. "I used to think strength meant silence," he said, "that a man's worth was in how much he could carry without complaint. But last night, I listened to my wife's story for the first time in years. I did not speak. I only heard her. And I learned that strength is not in bearing alone, but in sharing the burden." The teacher smiled. "Two hearts that listen can carry what one heart cannot." The blacksmith nodded, his voice trembling slightly. "Then perhaps I am learning to be strong." A ripple of warmth moved through the group. The people had begun to speak freely now, one voice after another, rising like notes of a song. They spoke of forgiveness, of understanding, of finding rest in the same lives that had once felt heavy. Elior watched them, his eyes wide with wonder. He realized that something beautiful was unfolding before him, a chorus not rehearsed, yet perfectly in tune. The teacher stood in the center, silent, his eyes soft with joy. He did not interrupt, did not add. He simply listened, as though each voice was a sacred instrument in a song that heaven itself had written long ago. When the last villager finished speaking, the air was thick with quiet gratitude. The teacher looked around at them all and said, "Do you hear what you have created?" The people exchanged glances, unsure of what he meant. "This," he said, touching his chest, "is worship, not of lips but of life. You have turned confession into song, sorrow into strength, and silence into peace. This is the voice of those who have learned to listen." The villagers lowered their heads, humbled by the truth of it. For a moment, there was only the sound of morning, the wind through the grass, the soft creak of a nearby gate, and the faint call of distant birds. The teacher lifted his hand, gesturing toward the horizon where the first shimmer of sunlight broke through the thinning mist. "The day calls," he said. "Go to your work, but do not leave behind what you have found here. Carry peace into your fields, your homes, your hands. Let the soil hear your gratitude and the sky your kindness." The people rose slowly, as though awakening from a sacred dream. They began to disperse, their hearts lighter, their steps softer. Elior lingered, still staring at the teacher. "You didn't speak much today," he said. "You only listened." The teacher smiled faintly. "Because sometimes," he said, "the lesson is not mine to give. It is yours to live." He turned his gaze toward the open fields beyond the village. The wind carried the faint scent of harvest and the murmur of rustling grain. "Come," he said quietly. "There is still more to learn. The earth is ready to speak, and we must be there to hear it." By the time they reached the far edge of the fields, the air had grown heavy again with the scent of rain. The clouds rolled slowly across the sky like gray waves, deep and full, their bellies glowing faintly with light. The teacher paused at the crest of a hill overlooking the valley, his robe tugged gently by the wind. The people who had followed him stood quietly, watching the shifting horizon as the first soft drops began to fall. This rain was not like the storm that had raged days before. It was gentler, steady, patient, almost tender in its rhythm. The drops fell upon their faces and hair, washing away the dust from their journey. The fields, tired and parched from the sun, drank deeply. The scent of wet soil filled the air, rich and alive. The teacher looked upward, eyes half closed, letting the water trace paths down his cheeks. "The heavens do not send rain twice for no reason," he said softly. "The first rain cleanses what is outside. The second renews what is within." Elior tilted his face toward the sky, the coolness of the drops a balm after the long walk. Around him, the villagers stood in silence, their hands open, their hearts absorbing what words could not describe. The teacher stepped forward, his feet sinking slightly into the damp earth, and beckoned the children who stood nearby to come closer. They ran to him eagerly, laughing as the rain darkened their tunics and plastered their hair to their faces. He knelt among them, his robe heavy with water, yet his expression full of light. "Do you see the rain, little ones?" he asked. One small girl nodded, her voice bright with innocence. "It's falling because the clouds are sad," she said. The teacher smiled gently. "No, child. The rain does not fall from sadness. It falls from fullness. When the clouds can no longer hold what they have gathered, they pour it out to give life below. So it is with the heart. When love is real, it cannot stay hidden. It must fall, so that others may grow." The children laughed, reaching their hands toward the sky as if to catch the lesson in their palms. Some of the adults smiled faintly, but others grew thoughtful, their eyes downcast. The teacher noticed. He stood slowly, raising his arms to the open sky. "Many hearts here are heavy," he said, "full not of love but of sorrow, of regret, of fear. You carry what you cannot release, and so your roots wither. Let this rain remind you that even grief can nourish if you allow it to fall." He let his arms drop, his voice lowering into something intimate, almost like a whisper shared between souls. "There is a time for holding on, and a time for letting go. You cannot carry every storm inside you. You must let it pass, and in its passing, be renewed." The rain began to fall harder, its rhythm deepening. Drops struck the leaves, the ground, their clothes. It was everywhere, surrounding them. Yet no one moved to find shelter. The people stood, motionless in reverence, as if the sky itself had begun to speak. The teacher reached down and took a handful of wet soil, letting it crumble between his fingers. "This earth," he said, "has seen many rains, many seasons, and yet it never refuses the water. It receives, it softens, it yields. That is how it remains alive." Elior watched him, his heart pounding with something he couldn't name. "Teacher," he said softly, "how do we let go as the earth does?" The teacher turned to him, the rain still streaming from his hair. "By remembering that you are dust," he said, "and the rain was made for you. The soil does not question the sky. It trusts that what falls will not destroy, but restore." Mara, who stood nearby, closed her eyes and whispered, "Then let this rain fall upon me." The teacher smiled, a quiet warmth spreading across his face. "It already has," he said. As he spoke, a gust of wind swept across the field, and the rain shifted direction, falling in waves that shimmered under the dim light. The children shrieked with joy, spinning in circles. The adults began to laugh softly, their fear of the storm's memory replaced by wonder. It was as if the rain itself had rewritten the meaning of water, no longer a force to fear, but a grace to receive. The teacher moved among them, placing his hand on shoulders, on bowed heads, on trembling hands. Wherever he touched, something unseen seemed to lift, a burden, a weight, an old ache. His voice rose slightly above the rain. "Let this water wash away, not your dirt, but your despair. Let it remind you that life, like the river, never ends. It only changes form." The rain began to slow, thinning to a fine mist. The sun, still hidden, began to reveal its presence through a soft golden hue that filled the clouds. The valley glistened as droplets clung to every blade of grass, every petal, every stone. The air was fresh, reborn. The teacher looked across the field, where the people now stood in quiet awe, faces lifted to the clearing sky. "Every drop that falls returns someday to the heavens," he said, "and so shall you. What comes from above must rise again. This is the promise written into every storm, every tear, every heart that dares to remain open." Elior felt his throat tighten. "Then the rain is not an ending," he murmured. The teacher looked at him, his eyes glowing with quiet truth. "No," he said. "It is a beginning wearing the face of surrender." For a long time they stayed there, the sound of the last raindrops fading into the gentle hum of the earth. The villagers began to walk toward the fields, their faces turned toward the distant hills where sunlight now touched the horizon. The teacher stood still for a moment longer, gazing upward, then whispered, "Now that the heavens have spoken, it is time for the earth to answer." He turned toward the path leading beyond the fields, toward a grove of olive trees where the scent of wet leaves mingled with the promise of evening. The people followed, their steps light, the soil soft beneath their feet, as though the rain had not only cleansed the land but also prepared it for something greater yet to come. The storm had passed, leaving the air bright and clean. The fields glistened beneath the sunlight, their soil dark and rich from the rain. Drops clung to every blade of grass, each one catching light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The teacher stood beneath an olive tree, its silver-green leaves dripping softly, and smiled as the children ran barefoot through puddles that shimmered like pools of glass. At first, the adults watched from a distance, their laughter restrained, their hands folded. They had grown used to caution, to keeping joy quiet, to walking carefully through life's fragile spaces. But the children knew nothing of that. Their feet slapped against the mud, their shouts rang through the valley, and their laughter carried far beyond the village. It was a sound so pure it seemed to make even the clouds pause to listen. The teacher stepped forward, his robe brushing the wet earth. One of the smaller boys, a child with wild curls and eyes bright as morning, ran past him, nearly stumbling. The teacher caught him by the arm and steadied him. The boy looked up, breathless, and grinned. "Are you coming to play, teacher?" he asked, his voice innocent, unfiltered. The teacher crouched down so they were eye to eye. "Do you think I have forgotten how?" The boy tilted his head, uncertain. "You don't look like someone who plays," he said honestly. The teacher laughed, a sound that startled the adults and made the children beam. "Then today," he said, I will remember. He slipped off his sandals and stepped into the nearest puddle. The water rippled around his feet, catching the sunlight. A few of the children gasped in delight, others clapped. When he crouched and splashed a small handful of water toward them, the laughter burst like a floodgate. Soon they were all running again, shouting, chasing, spinning in circles, the teacher among them like light woven into the air itself. From where they stood, the villagers watched in awe. Mara laughed first, softly at first, then freely, as if shaking off years of restraint. She waded into the field, her skirt soaked within moments, and lifted her hands to the sky. The others followed, men, women, elders, all shedding hesitation like old garments. Their laughter rose until the hills themselves seemed to echo with it. The teacher, still playing among the children, looked up and said through the joy, "Faith must dance." His voice carried across the field, and though it was not shouted, it was heard by every heart present. Faith that does not rejoice is faith that forgets the one who made laughter. You cannot speak of heaven and fear the sound of delight. He lifted a child into his arms, a girl with muddy feet and golden hair plastered to her forehead, and spun her gently until she squealed with joy. "Look," he said, "how freely she trusts. She does not ask if the ground will hold her or if the sky will fall. She knows only that she is safe in the moment. This is faith, not in words but in being." The adults, still laughing, began to slow. Some sat upon the wet grass, panting, their faces glowing from the exertion. The children continued to play, the world reduced to a song of running and laughter and light. The teacher placed the girl down and walked toward the gathered villagers, his robe clinging to his legs, his face serene. He looked at them and said, "The world tells you to grow old, but heaven calls you to remain young in heart. Wisdom without wonder turns cold. Duty without joy becomes a burden. Faith without play becomes fear." Elior, his journal forgotten in the grass, looked up from where he sat. "But teacher," he said, "how can we laugh when the world is so full of sorrow?" The teacher's smile did not fade. "You laugh not because sorrow is gone," he said, "but because love is greater. Laughter is not denial. It is remembrance that the heart was not made only to weep." He knelt beside Elior and placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Joy does not erase pain. It redeems it. Every smile, every act of play is a rebellion against despair. To laugh is to declare that darkness will not have the final word." The people grew quiet again, not out of shame, but reverence. The laughter of the children still filled the air behind them, a sound pure and bright, like sunlight made audible. The teacher turned toward the sound and closed his eyes. "Do you hear them?" he asked softly. Their laughter is prayer in its purest form. It rises without fear, without request, without measure. That is the kind of faith the Father delights in, the kind that simply lives. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet grass and olive leaves. The teacher opened his eyes and looked toward the horizon, where the light of evening had begun to melt into the clouds. "The kingdom of heaven," he said, "belongs to such as these, not because they are pure of fault, but because they have not forgotten wonder." The children continued their game until the sun dipped low and their shadows stretched long across the field. One by one, they began to tire, collapsing into the grass in fits of giggles. The adults gathered them gently, wiping mud from their faces, their hearts lighter than they had been in years. The teacher stood at the edge of the field, looking toward the west where the sky had turned the color of amber wine. The laughter behind him faded slowly, settling into a soft hum of peace. Elior walked to his side, the fading light catching in his eyes. "You reminded them how to live," he said quietly. The teacher's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "No," he said softly, "they reminded me why I came." The last light of day kissed the field, the puddles reflecting the glow like tiny mirrors of the heavens. The teacher took a deep breath, the air cool and sweet. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will walk again. The children have shown us joy. Now the elders must teach us wisdom." He began walking toward the dimming light, his footsteps soft against the damp earth, the echoes of laughter still lingering like music in the air that refused to fade. The night came softly, as if unwilling to disturb what the day had built. The last ripples of laughter still hung in the air like fading echoes, dissolving into the hum of crickets and the whisper of the olive leaves. The people had returned to their homes one by one, carrying the warmth of the day with them. Only a few remained near the edge of the field, Elior among them, sitting by the small fire that flickered weakly in the cooling air. The teacher sat nearby, silent, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flame. No one spoke for a while. The kind of stillness that followed laughter was not emptiness. It was fullness settling into quiet. The teacher's hands rested loosely on his knees, his robe dry now, though the hem still carried the faint scent of rain and earth. He looked not at the fire, but beyond it, into the horizon where the last traces of sunlight bled into the dark. Elior watched him for a long moment, the weight of unasked questions pressing against his chest. "Teacher," he finally said, "you seemed different today, lighter. But now," he hesitated, "now it feels as if you're carrying something heavy again." The teacher smiled faintly, though his eyes remained on the distance. "Every joy," he said, "is followed by silence. It is not the silence of loss, but of completion. When laughter fades, what remains is its echo, the stillness where the soul remembers what it means to be alive." He leaned forward slightly, feeding a small branch into the fire. Sparks leapt upward, then vanished into the night. The world believes that joy must always speak loudly, that peace must announce itself. But even silence can be song. Elior frowned softly. "Song?" The teacher nodded. "Yes. When the heart has known laughter, it learns how to rest. That rest, the peace after joy, the quiet after tears, is the truest music. Heaven listens to it more closely than all the hymns of men." The others sitting nearby, the blacksmith, Mara, a few of the children now grown drowsy from play, listened quietly. The firelight painted their faces in warm tones, and above them the stars began to appear, one by one, faint at first, then bright. The teacher tilted his head upward, gazing at the night sky. "Do you see the stars?" he asked softly. "They make no sound, yet they fill the heavens with praise. They shine not because they strive to be seen, but because it is their nature to give light." Mara, her voice gentle, said, "Sometimes I feel the same when I watch you, teacher. You do not force your words to be great, but they still change us." The teacher smiled again, but his expression carried something deeper this time, a quiet melancholy. "All words," he said, "even the truest ones, are meant to lead to silence. The seed must vanish for the tree to live. The voice must fade for the heart to hear." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of olive wood smoke and the sound of the river murmuring somewhere beyond the trees. The teacher's eyes grew distant again, though his body remained calm. Elior sensed it before anyone else did, that something unspoken stirred within him. It wasn't sorrow exactly, but the kind of stillness that comes when one stands at the edge of a long journey's end. "Teacher," Elior said carefully, "you speak tonight as though you are preparing to go somewhere." The teacher did not look at him immediately. He reached into the firelight, picking up a small twig, twirling it between his fingers before setting it down again. "Every path," he said, "has its rest, every season its close. Even the stars one day will fade from the sky, but not before their light has reached where it is meant to go." Elior's throat tightened. "Are you leaving us?" The teacher finally looked at him, his gaze steady, tender. "You cannot lose what I have given you," he said. "What you have learned was never mine to keep. It was always yours to live." The words fell into the silence like gentle rain, sinking deep. The blacksmith bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly. Mara wiped at her eyes, though no one had spoken of goodbye. The children, half asleep by the fire, stirred at the sound of his voice and then settled again, their small breaths joining the rhythm of the night. The teacher rose to his feet, the firelight dancing across his face. He looked around at each of them in turn, the ones who had followed him through storms and laughter, through doubt and revelation. "Do not be troubled," he said. "The silence that follows joy is not an ending. It is a beginning that does not yet have words." He stepped closer to Elior, placing a hand upon his shoulder. "You will write what you have seen," he said softly. "But do not write to remember me. Write so others may find the same peace that you have found." Elior felt a tremor pass through him, something between awe and fear. "But teacher," he whispered, "how will we know what to do when you are gone?" The teacher's smile deepened, almost radiant in its calm. "Listen," he said, "to the wind, to the silence, to one another. I am in all of these. The voice of heaven does not shout, it breathes." He turned then, walking a few steps away from the fire toward the open field. The stars above seemed to follow his movement, their light tracing the folds of his robe. He looked once more toward the heavens, then closed his eyes. Elior watched him standing there, so still, so utterly present that the night itself seemed to bend around him. The air grew heavy again, though not with rain this time, but with something unexplainable, like the hush before dawn or the pause before creation begins anew. The teacher opened his eyes, their reflection catching the starlight. "Come," he said softly without turning back. "The elders wait upon the hill. There are truths that must be spoken before the night is done." The people rose slowly, following him into the deepening dark. Behind them, the fire burned low, its embers pulsing like the last notes of a song that would never truly end. The stars hung low over the hill that night, vast and unblinking. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying with it the faint sound of the river far below. The people gathered at the summit where the teacher stood, his figure outlined against the pale light of the moon. His robe moved softly with the breeze, like a sail ready to depart. They had followed him through storm and stillness, through laughter and loss, through words that shook the heart and silences that rebuilt it. And now, something in the air, something quiet and certain, told them that this moment was different. Eliar stood near the front, his hands trembling, though he tried to keep them still. "Teacher," he said, "why have you brought us here?" The teacher's eyes swept over them, tender and calm. "Because every journey has a hill," he said. "A place where you see how far you've come and what must still be walked without me." The crowd stirred uneasily. Mara stepped forward, her voice small but firm. "Without you?" He nodded once. "Yes. The time has come for you to carry what I have given you into the world. The lessons were never meant to end here. They were meant to live through you." Murmurs spread through the group, confusion, sorrow, disbelief. The blacksmith clenched his hands. "But teacher," he said, his voice breaking, "we still need you. The storms still come. The nights still grow cold." The teacher turned toward him, his expression filled with understanding. "And yet you have learned to face them," he said. "You no longer wait for me to calm the waters. You remember how to be still in them. You no longer beg for warmth. You carry the fire in your hearts." He stepped closer to the group, his gaze moving from face to face. "I have walked beside you so that you might learn to walk without fear. Now you must walk beside one another." A child's voice broke through the quiet. "But where will you go?" The teacher smiled, kneeling before her. "Everywhere," he said. "Wherever kindness is shown, I will be there. Wherever forgiveness is given, I will be near. And wherever two hearts meet in peace, I will dwell between them." Tears welled in the eyes of many. Elior felt his throat tighten as he took a step forward. "You can't leave," he said. "Not yet. There's still so much we don't understand." The teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "Understanding is not the end of faith, Elior. It is the fruit of it. You will understand in time, not through me, but through what you choose to live." Elior bowed his head, his voice trembling. "Then let us go with you." The teacher's voice softened. "Where I go now, the path is not yet yours, but one day you will follow. For now, remain. Teach what you have seen, speak what you have heard, be the hands that heal and the hearts that listen." Mara fell to her knees. "Then let us at least walk you to the edge," she pleaded. The teacher smiled sadly. "You already have." The night deepened around them. The stars seemed to draw closer, as if leaning down to listen. The teacher raised his face to the heavens and said, "When you look upon the sky, remember, the light you see has traveled far to reach you. Some of it was sent from stars long gone, yet still it shines. So it will be with my words. They will travel through time, beyond me, beyond you, and still they will give light. He lowered his gaze again, meeting the eyes of those who had walked with him the longest. You have learned to listen to silence. Now learn to speak with love. You have learned to walk by faith. Now learn to lead by peace. A hush fell over them, broken only by the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. Elior looked up at him through his tears. "Teacher," he whispered, "before you go, will you read to us once more?" The teacher paused. His eyes softened, and a small smile crossed his face, the kind that carried both joy and sorrow. "Yes," he said quietly. "One last reading." He reached into the folds of his robe and drew out the old scroll. It had traveled through storm and sunlight, through hands both faithful and trembling. He unrolled it slowly, the parchment catching the moonlight. The people gathered closer, breath held, hearts open. His voice rose into the night, low, resonant, and alive. "Fear not, for I am with you. When you pass through the waters, they shall not drown you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, for you are mine, and I have called you by name." The words flowed over them like wind through reeds, like water over stone. Some closed their eyes, others lifted their faces to the sky, tears glimmering in the starlight. The teacher's tone grew softer as he continued, almost a whisper. "The weary shall find rest, the lost shall find their way home, and the broken shall be made whole again." When he finished, silence enveloped the hill. No one dared move. The scroll remained open in his hands, the edges fluttering in the wind. He looked up, his face illuminated by the faint silver of the moon. "Keep these words," he said, "not on parchment, but in your hearts. Let them speak when I no longer can." He rolled the scroll and handed it to Elior. The young man took it with trembling hands, knowing it was more than paper. It was a trust, a legacy of light. The teacher stepped back, the grass bending beneath his feet, his figure half shrouded by the glow of the stars. "Remember," he said, "the truth does not end when the voice grows quiet. It begins in those who choose to live it." The people wept softly as he turned toward the far horizon where the first faint line of dawn began to appear. The teacher looked at it, then back at them one last time. "Now," he said gently, "let there be peace." And with those words he began to walk, his form growing smaller against the rising light, until he was gone from their sight, yet nearer to their hearts than ever before. The wind carried his final words across the hill, whispering through the grass like a song that would never end. And as the sun broke over the horizon, Elior clutched the scroll to his chest, the dawn reflecting in his tears, ready to begin what had always been his part of the journey. The dawn light stretched across the hill, spilling gold and rose across the waking land. The teacher stood at its crest once more, the scroll resting gently in his hands. Below, the valley shimmered beneath a thin veil of mist, the kind that made the world feel halfway between heaven and earth. His followers had gathered again, drawn not by command, but by the quiet pull of love. They stood in a semicircle, faces lit by the rising sun, hearts heavy with the knowledge that this might be the last time they would hear his voice. He unrolled the scroll with deliberate care. The parchment caught the early light, glowing faintly as though something unseen moved through it. The teacher looked up, his eyes sweeping over them. "You have heard many words," he said softly, "but now you must listen with the soul. For this reading is not about what has been, but what will always be." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind stilled. The teacher raised his face toward the horizon and began to read. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." His voice carried over the valley, steady, resonant, alive with meaning that pierced beyond language. The sound of it blended with the breath of the morning wind, so that it seemed as if creation itself was listening. Birds stilled in the trees. The grass shimmered as though bowed by reverence. The teacher continued, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go, I will return again, so that where I am, you may also be." Mara closed her eyes. tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The blacksmith bowed his head, his calloused hands clasped before him. Even Eller, who had resolved to remain strong, felt his chest tighten. Each word felt like a farewell and a promise woven together. The teacher's tone softened as he continued reading. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be afraid, for I am with you, even to the end of the age. The words lingered in the air like light that refused to fade. The teacher closed his eyes for a moment, letting the wind move through the silence. His robe fluttered gently around his feet. The people watched him, the sunlight gathering behind him until he seemed clothed in it. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but filled with warmth. You have heard these words before, he said, but today hear them not as promise alone, but as truth already living in you. Eternal life does not begin beyond the horizon. It begins in every act of love, every moment of peace you share. He turned to Elior, who stood near the front, clutching the scroll he had been given. Elior, he said, you will carry these words forward, but remember, ink fades. Love does not. Let your life be the parchment upon which these truths are written. Elior swallowed hard and nodded. I will, teacher, he whispered. But how will we know when to speak? How will we know what to say? The teacher smiled gently. You will know when silence stirs the heart to speak. You will know because peace will lead you there. Do not chase truth. It will walk beside you. He then looked toward Mara and the others. The kingdom you seek is not far. It is within you, quiet as breath, steady as the pulse of your heart. When you gather, when you forgive, when you love one another, it will rise among you like the dawn. He raised the scroll once more and read the final lines. And now, faith remains, hope remains, love remains. But the greatest of these is love. For love bears all things, believes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what was being given. When the last word left his lips, he rolled the scroll and held it close to his chest. This, he said quietly, is my final reading, not of parchment, but of life itself. The wind stirred then, stronger than before, carrying the echo of his voice across the valley. It seemed to move with purpose, brushing through the trees, over the river, through the fields, as though it sought to deliver his words to every unseen ear. The people listened, hearts still and full. When the wind faded, the teacher lifted his gaze to the sky where the morning had ripened into gold. Do not mourn what ends, he said. Mourn only what is never lived, for the truth has not left you. It has taken root, and soon it will, tainola, bloom in ways you cannot yet imagine. He looked at them one last time, his expression both tender and eternal. Remember this, darkness is not the enemy of light. It is the canvas upon which light is seen. He stepped forward to the edge of the hill, the scroll still in his hands. Behind him, the people remained still, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the fragile holiness that held them. The teacher turned his face toward the valley below. The light of the sun caught his form, wrapping him in a radiance that blurred the line between shadow and spirit. His robe shimmered with the color of the dawn. Elior took a step forward, wanting to speak, but no words came. The teacher looked back once more and said softly, all that has been written now must be lived. And with that, he began to descend the hill, the golden light following him like a living thing. The people stood silently as the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance. As night began to fall once more, the sky painted itself in deep hues of purple and silver. Elior stood alone at the crest of the hill, the scroll pressed against his heart, the words of the final reading echoing endlessly in his mind. Below, the first stars flickered awake, tiny fires in the vast dark, and he whispered, we will live it, teacher. We will live it all. The dawn broke quietly over the valley, pale light spilling through the mist that clung to the fields. Birds stirred in the trees, their song hesitant at first, like the world itself was unsure if it should wake. Elior opened his eyes slowly. The grass beneath him was damp with dew, and the air carried that cool sweetness that follows a night of rain. For a fleeting moment, he thought he could hear the teacher's voice carried in the wind, but when he sat up, the hill was empty. The place where the teacher had stood was untouched, only the faint imprint of footprints in the soil, already softening under the morning light. The fire from the night before had burned down to ashes, gray and quiet. The people began to rise one by one, their expressions dazed, eyes searching the horizon as if expecting to see him returning through the mist. "He's gone," someone whispered. The words hung in the air like something fragile that no one wanted to acknowledge. Mara stood, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "He said he would go," she murmured. "But I thought he'd wait until we were ready." Elior pressed his hand to the ground where the teacher had last stood. The soil was still warm. "He waited," he said softly. "We just didn't know we were ready." The villagers gathered around the ashes of the fire. No one wept, though their eyes were full. Instead, they stood in silence, listening. It wasn't the silence of loss. It was something deeper. The sound of the river below, the rustle of the olive trees, the whisper of the wind, all of it seemed to breathe his name. Mara knelt beside Elior. "What? Now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Elior looked toward the scroll clutched in his arms. "Now we do what he told us to," he said. "We live what he spoke." The blacksmith, his hands rough and scarred, stared at the rising sun. "But where do we begin?" Elior's gaze softened. Where he began, with kindness. The morning unfolded slowly. Some began to gather stones from the base of the hill, stacking them gently into a small circle. Not a monument, not a shrine. Just a simple place to sit and remember. Others filled jugs from the river, washed their faces, and spoke softly of the teacher's words as though trying to hold them between their palms before they faded into memory. When the sun climbed higher, Elior stood. The scroll trembled slightly in his hands as he unrolled it. "He said we must keep his words not in ink, but in heart," he said. "But maybe it's all right to let both speak." He began to read, his voice steady though the air seemed to thicken with emotion. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." The words poured from him like water over stone. The villagers listened, heads bowed, hands clasped. Some wept quietly, not from sorrow but from the strange comfort that those words still carried weight even though the voice that once spoke them was gone. When Elior finished, he lowered the scroll. "He said the truth must be lived," he said, his voice trembling. "So we will live it." Mara stepped forward, her face illuminated by sunlight. "Then let's begin here," she said. "Let this hill be where peace begins." The blacksmith nodded, his deep voice firm. "We will build, not in his memory, but in his way." The others murmured their agreement. Some took tools from their packs, others began to gather branches, stones, and rope. No one gave orders, no one argued, each moved with quiet purpose, as if the same thought guided them all. By midday, they had built a simple table from the stones and wood nearby, a place where all could sit and eat together. Beside it, they placed a bowl of clear water from the river. Mara laid a single loaf of bread upon the surface. "For whoever hungers," she said. When the work was done, they sat together beneath the shade of the olive trees. The air was warm, filled with the scent of earth and leaves. For a while they said nothing. It was enough to be there, to breathe, to remember. Elior closed his eyes and thought of the teacher's face, the way he had smiled when he spoke of light and peace. The memory was vivid, alive, but it didn't ache anymore. It felt instead like the glow of the morning itself, present, enduring, unseen, yet everywhere. He looked around at the people, at Mara, at the blacksmith, at the children who laughed softly as they played in the grass, and he realized that they no longer looked lost. The sorrow was still there, but beneath it was something stronger, purpose. "The truth has not left us," Elior whispered. "It's alive in us." The wind stirred then, carrying the scent of bread and olive oil, and the leaves whispered overhead. Some of the villagers turned their faces toward the sound, certain they heard something within it, a familiar voice, gentle as the dawn. "Be still," the wind seemed to say. "I am near." The warmth that followed felt like an answer, and as they sat together beneath the trees, breaking bread, sharing stories, and listening to the world around them, the morning no longer felt empty. It was alive. Alive with peace, with hope, with the quiet certainty that though the teacher had gone from their sight, he had not gone from their hearts. Elior smiled faintly, lifting his gaze toward the horizon. "He taught us how to listen," he murmured, "and now the world is speaking." The blacksmith looked up from where he sat. "What do you hear, Elior?" Elior took a slow breath, eyes soft with wonder. "I hear the beginning of something," he said, "the sound of us remembering how to live." Above them, the clouds parted, and sunlight poured over the valley once more, golden, endless, alive. The same light that had once fallen on the teacher now fell upon them, as if blessing the promise they had made. And as the river sang below, and the wind carried his echo through the leaves, the people of the hill began to rise, ready to walk again, this time not as followers, but as bearers of the peace he had left behind. The days that followed were slow and golden. The rains had ended, and the earth was alive with new green, the kind that comes only after surrender, after the storm. The hill where the teacher once stood had become a place of quiet gathering. Not for worship, not for ritual, but for remembering. The people came to speak, to read from the scroll, to listen to the wind in the olive trees as if it carried his voice still. But soon it was not enough to simply remember. The stillness that once comforted them began to stir something deeper, an urging, a call to move. The teacher had said his words must not stay on parchment but live in hearts. Hearts were not meant to remain still. They were meant to walk, to carry light into dark places. It was Elior who first spoke what everyone had been feeling. "We cannot keep this hill to ourselves," he said one morning, his eyes fixed on the valley below. "He gave us peace, not so we would guard it, but so we would share it." Mara, seated beside him beneath the olive tree, nodded slowly. "Then we will carry it where he once walked," she said, "and beyond." The blacksmith, who had once feared the silence, looked up from sharpening his tools. "How far do we go?" Elior smiled faintly. "As far as the leaves fall." That afternoon, they gathered beneath the great tree that had watched over them since the beginning. Its branches were wide, its leaves golden from the change of season. Elior reached up, took one between his fingers, and let it drift to the ground. "He said the leaf does not mourn when it falls," he whispered. "It trusts what it cannot see." He looked around at them, at Mara, at the blacksmith, at the children who had once played at the teacher's feet. "We will each take one," he said. "Wherever we go, we'll leave it behind, not as memory, but as promise." They each plucked a leaf, holding it carefully as if it were made of light, and so began the spreading. The first group traveled east, across the narrow river where the teacher had once taught them to step without fear. The land there was dry, the people weary. They brought with them not sermons, but bread. They sat beside strangers, shared food, and told them the story of the one who had read beneath the autumn leaves, the one who taught that peace was stronger than pride, that forgiveness could rebuild what even storms had broken. The second group went south, to the fields scorched by summer heat. There they found men who worked from sunrise to dusk, their backs bent, their hope thin. Mara stayed among them for a time, helping them sow their fields and teaching them to rest without shame. She left behind a single golden leaf on the threshold of their barn. Years later, the farmers would say that every harvest since had been gentler, more merciful, as if the earth itself had learned to breathe. Elior went north toward the villages near the mountains. He carried only the scroll and a small pouch of olive seeds. He read the teacher's words in marketplaces, beside wells, in courtyards filled with children. "Blessed are the pure in heart," he would say, "for they shall see God." And then he would hand out seeds, saying, "Plant these, let your roots remember what your hearts have heard." Some laughed at him, some turned away, but a few listened and planted. And in the years that followed, olive trees began to grow where none had grown before, their leaves whispering like the ones from the teacher's hill. The blacksmith traveled west, where the sea met the cliffs. There he found fishermen and builders, men hardened by salt and sun. He helped them mend their nets, sharpen their blades, and in the quiet moments told them of the teacher who had built peace with his words and mended hearts with his silence. Before leaving, he forged a small emblem from his own iron, a circle, unbroken, representing eternity, and nailed it above the harbor gate. Beneath it, he He placed a single olive leaf. Over time, travelers began to notice. Wherever they went, they found these golden leaves, pressed into stone walls, tucked beneath doors, floating in wells, woven into the corners of prayer mats. They began to ask, who leaves these? And the answer always came the same way, from someone who had heard the story. Those who follow the one who read among the Hatorse. Autumn leaves. The message spread like wind over fields of ripened grain, not through power, not through command, but through kindness. The broken helped the broken. The weary comforted the weary. Peace became contagious. Years passed, and the hill remained quiet, though not forgotten. The olive tree grew broader, its roots deepening. New generations came, sitting beneath its shade. They spoke of the teacher not as one who had vanished, but as one who still walked wherever peace was made. And in every village touched by the followers' steps, stories bloomed, stories of sudden calm in the midst of fear, of enemies embracing, of storms passing without harm. People began to say that whenever they found a golden leaf resting where no tree grew, they knew he had been near. One evening, long after the first journeys had ended, Elior returned to the hill. His hair had grayed, his hands weathered. He carried nothing but the scroll and a pouch of dried leaves. He stood beneath the same olive tree, now vast, its branches stretching wide across the sky. He knelt and scattered the leaves across the earth, the wind lifting them one by one. "Go where he walks," he murmured. "Go where hearts are waiting." As the last leaf drifted upward, the wind turned warm and gentle. It moved through the grass like a sigh, brushing against his cheek. Familiar. Tender. Elior closed his eyes and smiled. "Yes," he whispered. "I know you're here." He stayed there until the stars began to appear, their light soft over the valley below. And as night fell, the leaves continued to travel, carried by the wind to places unseen, each one bearing the memory of the teacher's peace, always alive and unending, wherever it came to rest. The hill stood quiet beneath the moonlight, the olive tree swaying gently, its branches whispering to the heavens. And somewhere far beyond the valley, in a village unknown, a single golden leaf landed softly on a windowsill, its edges glowing faintly in the dark. Inside, a child awoke and smiled at the sight, whispering into the night, "Be still. He is near." Years passed quietly, folding one into another like pages in a book well worn by time. The seasons came and went across the valley, and the olive tree upon the hill grew vast and ancient. Its branches reached wider each year, its roots deeper, its leaves turning from green to gold and back again with the rhythm of the earth. Beneath it, where the teacher once sat reading, the ground was smooth and hollowed from the footsteps of those who came to remember. Elior was no longer young. His beard had turned white as the morning mist, his back bent with years of walking, but his eyes, though lined and weary, still held the same quiet fire that had first lit when he'd heard the teacher speak. He climbed the hill one final time as the wind stirred through the valley, carrying the scent of autumn, the season when it had all begun. He reached the top slowly, leaning on his staff, his breath shallow but steady. The air was cool, and the sky above stretched pale and clear, washed in the soft light of evening. The olive tree greeted him with a whisper, its leaves shimmering like coins in the fading sun. Beneath its shade, Elior spread out a worn piece of parchment. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled it, the same scroll the teacher had given him so long ago. The ink had faded, but the words were still there, etched as deeply into his heart as they were upon the page. He traced the first line with his fingertip. "Fear not, for I am with you." A smile touched his lips. "You always were," he whispered. For a long while he sat in silence, listening. The world had changed since that morning when the teacher had left. Villages had grown, children had become elders, and peace had taken root in places where once only sorrow lived. The golden leaves that the followers had carried across the lands had spread farther than anyone could count. People spoke of them with reverence, calling them blessings from heaven, though few knew where they had truly come from. Yet here, upon the hill, time felt different. The wind moved through the branches in the same rhythm it always had, and in that sound, Elior could still hear him, the voice that had changed everything. He closed his eyes and remembered the laughter of children splashing through rainwater, the echo of the teacher's voice in the empty temple, the warmth of bread shared beneath the stars, the peace that came not from answers, but from presence. It all felt near again, as if time itself had circled back to that first autumn day when everything began. "Teacher," Elier murmured, his voice trembling, "I have done as you said. I wrote what I saw. I lived what you taught. And still, I miss you." The wind moved gently through the tree, and a single golden leaf drifted downward, landing in his lap. He picked it up carefully, his eyes filling with tears. "I know," he whispered, smiling faintly. "You never really left." He looked out over the valley. Below he could see the villages, more of them now than ever before, scattered like lanterns across the land. Smoke rose from their chimneys, mingling with the orange light of sunset. Somewhere out there, people were still reading his words, still breaking bread, still forgiving, still learning to be still. Elier reached into his cloak and took out a small piece of charcoal. On the empty space at the bottom of the scroll, he began to write slowly, his letters uneven but deliberate. He read beneath the autumn leaves, and the world grew still. He spoke not of power, but of peace, not of fear, but of love. And those who listened learned that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of God. He paused, resting his hand upon the parchment, the ink smudged slightly beneath his touch. "There," he said softly. "That is enough." The light began to fade. The horizon blushed, with hues of gold and violet. Elier leaned back against the trunk of the olive tree, the bark warm against his shoulders. His breathing slowed, his gaze fixed upon the sky where the first star appeared, a single, steady light. He closed his eyes and spoke one last time, the words barely more than a breath. "Be still. He is near." And then, with the faintest smile, he grew still himself. The evening deepened, and the hill grew quiet. The parchment rested beside him, the last line glowing faintly in the twilight. A breeze lifted it gently, rolling it closed as if to preserve the words within. The golden leaf that had fallen into Elier's lap drifted upward again, carried by the wind, higher and higher, until it disappeared into the fading light. Down in the valley, a child walking with his mother stopped and looked toward the hill. "Mama," he said softly, pointing to the tree. "Look, the leaves are shining." And for a moment, it seemed as if the great olive tree itself was glowing from within, its branches trembling with light. The wind that swept through the valley carried a whisper so soft it could have been the sigh of the world itself. "Peace, peace, peace." The child smiled, his hand tightening around his mother's. "He's near," he said simply, though he did not know how he knew. Above, the stars had begun to bloom across the heavens, each one burning steady and pure. The valley rested, the fields slept, and the hill stood watch beneath the endless sky. The teacher's story, once written upon parchment, now lived in hearts across the world, carried on the wind, spoken in the laughter of children, written in every act of kindness that touched another life. And so it was that even as the night deepened, the light did not fade. It moved quietly through the world like breath, soft, eternal, unseen, reminding all who would listen that peace was not gone, only waiting to be remembered again. In the hush of the valley, the olive leaves shimmered once more, and the world, just for a moment, grew still. The world had changed, yet the echo of his voice remained. Centuries drifted by like rivers over stone, reshaping lands and names, but somewhere in the heart of time, the teacher's words continued to breathe. They didn't fade as the ink on parchment did. They lived in whispers, in laughter, in the quiet pauses between one heartbeat and the next. The olive tree still stood upon the hill, older now, its trunk thick and knotted with years, its roots clutching the soil like memory itself. Its branches stretched wide, shading the resting place of Elier, who had long since returned to the dust he once rode upon. The wind came and went as it always had, faithful, unhurried, carrying with it the scent of the seasons and the song of unseen things. On certain days, when the world grew too loud, people still climbed the hill. They came not because they were told to, but because something deep within them stirred, a longing to listen again. Some came barefoot, some brought children, some carried grief heavy as stone. And when they reached the tree, they sat beneath it in silence, not knowing why they felt lighter there, only that they did. One such morning, a young girl climbed the hill alone. Her name was Lyra. She had heard stories of the teacher all her life, though no one remembered his face anymore. Some said he was a myth, a legend woven into the roots of time. Others said he had walked the earth as light disguised as flesh. Lyra didn't know what to believe. She only knew that her heart had been restless, too many voices, too much noise. So she came to find the silence everyone spoke of. When she reached the top, the world opened before her, the valley, the river, the golden fields beyond. She sat at the base of the olive tree and pressed her ear to its trunk, as if hoping to hear something from within. At first, there was only the sound of wind moving through leaves. Then, faintly, she heard it. A murmur, soft and rhythmic, like words spoken from far away. She closed her eyes, and the whispers became clearer. Blessed are those who find peace in stillness, for they shall hear what the world forgets. The voice was not loud, yet it filled the air around her. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the tree, from the wind, from within her chest. Lyra's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know the words, but they felt like home. She sat there until the sun began to set, the light dripping through the branches in waves of amber and gold. When she finally stood, something inside her had quieted. She reached up, plucked a single leaf from the tree, and held it against her heart. As she turned to go, she noticed something carved faintly into the stone near the tree's roots. The letters were worn, but she could still read them. Be still. He is near. Her breath caught. She knelt and traced the words with her fingers, and for a moment she swore she could hear footsteps beside her, the soft, patient kind that never hurried. Lyra left the hill at dusk, walking slowly, her hand still pressed to the leaf. When she reached the valley below, the air seemed lighter. The river sparkled as though reflecting more than sunlight. It shimmered like something eternal moving through it. In the days that followed, Lyra began to read aloud what she remembered of the whispers beneath the olive tree. People gathered around her, farmers, travelers, children, and listened. Her words were not perfect. Sometimes she forgot the phrasing, sometimes she added her own. But the peace that filled the air when she spoke was unmistakable. And so, the reading continued. It spread again as it had before, not in temples or grand halls, but in gardens, in fields, in small houses lit by the dim glow of candles. The words traveled across mountains and seas, carried by those who sought peace more than power. In every age there were readers, ordinary men and women who felt the same stirring Lyra had felt. They did not preach, they read softly, letting the silence between words do most of the teaching. And wherever they read, the world seemed to pause, just for a heartbeat, as if recognizing itself. The olive tree remained through it all, through wars, through rebuilding, through the rise and fall of empires. It shed its leaves each year, and each year the wind carried them farther. They found their way into the cracks of city walls, into rivers, onto the windowsills of those who had forgotten how to hope. Some swore they glowed faintly at night, as if remembering the hands that had once held them. And always, when the wind grew still and the light turned gold, one could almost hear it. The faint rustling that was not quite the sound of leaves, not quite the breath of air, but something older, deeper. A reading that never ended. Be still, and know that I am here. In the laughter of children, in the kindness of strangers, in the quiet of the morning, and the hush of the night, I'm near. The world turned, and ages passed. The olive tree continued to whisper, its roots now one with the bones of those who had once listened. And somewhere, in every generation, someone would pause, by a tree, a river, or a quiet room, and hear it again, that gentle rhythm, that voice without sound, that eternal reading that had begun so long ago beneath the autumn leaves. The voice would say what it had always said, as softly as the first breath of dawn. Peace, child. You are not alone. The wind would stir, the leaves would tremble, the hearts of those who listened would remember, and the story, his story, would begin again, forever written upon the world's stillness, carried endlessly by the whisper of leaves that never truly fall.